So welcome back to many of you. Welcome to those who maybe weren't able to come up last night because of the bad weather. Again, I'm Father John Carci, the current rector here. And Bishop Barron really beautifully laid out what the seminary has meant to him, and I think it's fair to say has meant to all of us who've gone through and are now priests in the Archdiocese of Chicago or all across the country and even the world in some cases. It's always mentioned in his biography, and you certainly saw it here, but I don't think it's always fully appreciated, the fact that so many hundreds of men who are now priests in parishes all over the world as pastors, a couple of bishops I know, were not only taught by Bishop Barron, but were formed by him as a formator here at the seminary. And so while millions of people have downloaded his social media content, I think it's fair to say that hundreds of thousands, and through the ripple effect, I'm sure millions as well, have been touched by the parish priest that he helped to form. That same thing in many ways could be said of the faculty member who will be directing things this morning, our program this morning. Dr. Melanie Barrett joined the faculty about the same time I did, but I went off for further studies, and she launched right into teaching, which she's been doing very generously and faithfully for almost 20 years now. As you heard in the Q&A last night, where the rubber hits the road with these questions of objective truth and so forth, really falls in the laps oftentimes of the parents and the teachers and the Newman Center chaplains. You know, how do you somehow convey this? How do you instill it in the next generation? Well, Melanie is the head of our moral theology department, and there's probably no area of study in the seminary that's more important for forming the future priests to be able to help prepare parents and teachers and so forth to wrestle with those very kinds of questions. And so, a very accomplished scholar in her own right in moral theology, but a much beloved teacher here for now almost a generation of new priests. I'm privileged to call her a colleague and pleased to call her a friend. Dr. Melanie Barrett.
Good morning, everyone. A warm welcome to those joining us both on site and online. As Father Carci mentioned last night, all of the papers presented here last night and today will be published in Chicago Studies, which is the academic journal published by our faculty. You can subscribe for free to the journal by going to our website, usml.edu, and then clicking on the link to Chicago Studies. Also, it's important to note that our campus bookstore will be open immediately after this event, and we have a wide variety of books to purchase for Bishop Barron. So if you'd like to add to your collection or buy future Christmas presents for your friends and family members, come to the bookstore. The schedule for this morning is as follows. First, Bishop Barron will present his second lecture. Second, two members of our faculty, Dr. Patricia Pintado Murphy and Father Brendan Lupton, will offer formal responses to Bishop Barron's two lectures. Per tradition, the Cardinal Meyer lectures were designed to be an intellectual engagement at a high level, so Father Lupton and Dr. Pintado will offer critique and challenge, though in the spirit of charity. We love Bishop Barron. He's our former colleague and rector, so we'll go easy on him, but not too easy. Third, the audience will be invited to ask questions. And I ask you to keep in mind when you're preparing your questions to keep them as brief and concise as possible so as to leave space for other people to ask questions. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our 2022 Meyer lecturer, Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron holds a doctorate in theology from the Institut Catholique in Paris, a master's degree in philosophy from the Catholic University of America, and a Master of Divinity degree from Mundelein Seminary. As mentioned in the brief film that you just saw, he taught theology here for almost 25 years, from 1992 through 2015, and he served as rector president from 2012 to 2015. In 2015, Pope Francis appointed him to be an auxiliary bishop of Los Angeles. In the late 2000s, Bishop Barron founded the global media ministry Word on Fire, which includes a website, a scholarly institute, which publishes the journal Evangelization and Culture, and multiple forms of media outreach, all comprising a lay ecclesiastical movement with global outreach oriented toward the renewal of the Catholic Church. Bishop Barron has published 18 books, the most recent of which is Light from Light, a theological reflection on the Nicene Creed, published in 2021. Also well known are Letter to a Suffering Church, 2019, Arguing Religion, a Bishop Speaks at Facebook and Google, 2018, his biblical commentary on 2 Samuel, 2015, his book-length interview by John Allen called To Light a Fire on the Earth, 2017, and The Priority of Christ, 2007. So without further ado, let us offer a warm welcome to Bishop Robert Barron.
Well, good morning, everybody. Good to see you back. Most came back from last night. That's a good sign. How many are here for the first time today? I'm just curious. There are a lot of you here just for the first time today. So what I did is a bit different than the usual Meyer lecture procedure, which is to give two discrete talks. Mine really is just one talk that I subdivided. So let me just spend about a minute and a half for the benefit of those who weren't here last night, kind of setting the stage. What I'm talking about is what Charles Taylor, the philosopher, calls the buffered self. That means the self that's cut off from contact with the transcendent. And I identify that as very typical of a lot of people today, especially young people, and a reason why there's so much disaffiliation from the churches. This lack of contact with the transcendent, something taken for granted up until very modern times. Taylor argues that we're probably the first culture in human history, we in the contemporary West, who think we can find a fulfilled life apart from a relationship to a transcendent source. So that's the problem that we're dealing with. What I'm suggesting now in this paper is strategies for breaking through the buffered self. And I'm using the three great transcendental properties of being, namely the true, the good, and the beautiful. And I'm arguing that the church is maybe the privileged instrument for this breaking through of the buffered self. We should not come to the secular culture hat in hand, begging for a place around the table on the secular culture's terms. No, we are the great bearers of this tradition that links human beings to the transcendent mystery of God. And so we go forth, I quoted Paul Tillich last night in his German, said, mit klingendem Spiel, we go forth with fife and drum as a church, because I'm dealing all the time in my social media ministry with young people especially, who are heart sick, they're soul sick because of a lack of connection to the transcendent mystery of God. And so that's the task, I think, of our time. Call it the new evangelization if you want, but that's the task of our time. So what I did last night after that setup was I talked about the truth. And I contrasted it to the sort of information gathering that's so typical of our time. So on these machines that we have all kinds of data literally at our fingertips, but data that we control, that we manipulate, that we can send and receive, and so on. And I contrasted it to the classical understanding of truth, which is something that we don't manipulate and control, but rather changes us and enters into us. I'll leave you just with this one image from the presentation last night from Iris Murdoch, the great Irish novelist and philosopher, where she said, think of someone who's lost in great depression and anxiety, self-preoccupied, and then they look out the window and they see, she names it a kestrel, it's a kind of small falcon, and they see that falcon, and suddenly everything falls away. And they're so enraptured by the goodness and the beauty of that image that everything falls away, and they said, now everything is kestrel. And then when they turn back to their problems, which they inevitably will, they somehow seem less pressing. Well, that was for her. She's a Platonist. That was an example of how the good breaks through. We're not manipulating it, controlling it on our terms, but the good breaks into our consciousness. And I argued last night during the Q&A that so many of the great artists, and I'll refer to some of them today, name those moments of breakthrough when we call it grace breaks into our lives. Okay, so that was the talk last night, was the setup and then truth. So what I'm going to do today in my time is talk about the good and then the beautiful and how these serve to break through the buffered self. So that's the program. Does this light go on here? I seem to have like a shadow on this. Is there a way to put this on? Who knows how to put this light on? It was much better last night. I could actually see my text better. Is there a way just to turn this on? There you go. There you go. Beautiful. Beautiful. I still got it. Some authority around here. Okay. So, I want to turn now to the second great transcendental property of being, namely the good. Like the true, the good is, in our highly relativistic time, a problematic notion. For it appears as an imposition on one's freedom and capacity to decide for oneself the meaning of one's life. This is precisely why, as we saw, the notion of the good is so central to Iris Murdoch's strategy of decentering the ego. I'd like to begin my analysis by drawing a distinction parallel to the one that I made in the last section between gathering information and true knowing. Just as the assembling and sharing of data is central to the digital culture, so is the familiar gesture now of liking or unliking. We might be tempted to appreciate liking as a perhaps less intense form of loving, since both involve the signaling of a positive attitude towards someone or something, but this is to miss the crucial difference. When one likes another, she's expressing only the most superficial kind of approbation. This approval does not reach deeply into the other, nor does it come from a profound place in the interiority of the one who grants it. And this very ephemerality and superficiality is what's made the term so appropriate in the digital space, in which one can casually like a posting or a picture or a story and promptly move on to something more interesting. Or one can garner hundreds or thousands of likes without ever establishing anything even close to a relationship with the one who bestows the designation. And again, very much like information, likes are utterly under the control of the self, since they involve no real commitment to the other and are bestowed from the safe and antiseptic distance of a computer keyboard. Now, in sharp contrast to liking is loving, which, in the definition offered by Iris Murdoch, this is wonderful, I think. Listen now, this is Murdoch's characterization of loving. Quote, the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. Isn't that good? The ego's like a black hole, I said last night, tends to draw all things into itself and under its aegis. To love, see, is to break out of that. The difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. And how reminiscent this Murdoch formulation is to Aquinas' characterization of love as, quote, willing the good of the other, close quote. To love is to break free of the gravitational pull of the ego, to relocate the self, as it were, in the other. When I like you, let's say on Facebook, I'm in control. When I love you, I've given myself to you in such a way that I am no longer in control of our relationship. When I like you, you move within the ambit of my desires and preoccupations. When I love you, my life is no longer about me, it's about you. The novelist Jonathan Franzen puts it this way, quote, to love a specific person, to identify with their struggles and joys as if they were your own, you have to surrender a large part of yourself, close quote. Karl Wojtyła, and I'm using his John Paul II's name when he was a philosophical writer. Wojtyła catches the rarity and strangeness of love by distinguishing it from any sort of selfish desire. Here's Wojtyła, quote, goodwill is quite free of self-interest, the traces of which are conspicuous in love as desire. Goodwill is the same as selflessness in love. Not, I long for you as a good, but I long for your good. I long for what is good for you. To get that, everybody, is to get Christianity in many ways. Again, to love is not, I long for you as a good. Aren't you good? Aren't you wonderful? See, for me. But rather, I long for what is good for you. In his commentary on love and responsibility, Wojtyła's great text, the John Paul II specialist Rocco Buttiglione observes, quote, the desire for the other as an answer to one's own ontological insufficiency and as the completion and company of one's own person no longer comes first. Something else comes first, the wonder aroused by the other's beauty and the will that that interior beauty of the person, which is perceived in the lover's glance, should realize itself, close quote. Though the other's loveliness first attracted me, I no longer want it for me, but for her, her reality mattering more for me than my own. Now, following the prompt of D.C. Schindler, the contemporary philosopher, we can correlate this demarcation between liking and loving to a crucial distinction between two very different understandings of the will and its activity. Though its roots are in the late Middle Ages, especially in the thought of William of Ockham, the typically modern sense of the will comes to us perhaps most directly through the work of John Locke. Though it certainly is reflected in his explicitly political writing, most notably the two treatises on government, Locke's interpretation of the will is most fully articulated in his epistemological masterpiece, the Essay Concerning Human Understanding. In this text, he lays out a revolutionary idea of the will as primarily an active power of self-determination. If that sounds familiar, it's not an accident. That's crept down now totally into our culture. Whereas on the traditional reading, a good outside of the will prompts that faculty to respond. On Locke's reading, the will has ontological primacy and remains undetermined by anything outside of itself. Here's Locke's own account. I'm quoting. For that which determines the general power of directing to this or that particular direction is nothing but the agent itself exercising the power it has in that particular way, close quote. In a radical departure here from the standard interpretation, Locke holds that the direct object of the will is not the thing, but an action, namely its own action. Rather than appreciating the will as extending itself out into reality, Locke effectively shrinks its area of concern. Here's D.C. Schindler again, quote, it, the Lockean will, no longer stretches out beyond the agent, but extends only as far as the boundaries of the self, close quote. And in Locke's own extremely clear and illuminating formulation, I'm quoting now from Locke himself, the will or power of volition is conversant about nothing but our own actions, terminates there, and reaches no further, close quote. We might say that the will for Locke perhaps determines itself toward a perceived good, but it is not determined by that good. So concerned is he to maintain the control of the will over itself that Locke argues that the self, quote, not only begins its act of will from itself alone, but that movement likewise ends exclusively in the self as the will's proper object, close quote. Whatever connection eventually obtains with the world outside of the dynamics of the will remains secondary and extrinsic, subordinate to the sovereignty and sufficiency of the choosing self. Detached, turned inward, expressing approval or disapproval without personal connection, this Lockean will is perfectly attuned to the world of liking rather than loving. Do you ever hear a teenager today say, well, I decide, it's up to me, I determine the meaning of my life, it's my freedom? Well, what was a high philosophical perspective in John Locke is now the default position of most teenagers today. It's most instructive now to compare this interpretation to that which was on offer in the pre-modern context. Thomas Aquinas' account will serve nicely as a contrast to Locke's. Though Thomas does indeed speak of liberum arbitrium, free will, as, in one sense, its own cause, causa sui, he says. Nevertheless, Thomas insists that this self-determination is only one dimension of the will's operation. Ingredient in every choice is the influence of the body, passions, mind, and understanding, and behind all of these, the most important cause, namely the external good, which ultimately rouses the interest of the will. Moreover, the particular good, which immediately interests the will, is itself embedded in a higher and more general good that it serves, and that in another again, and so forth. The essential point is that for Aquinas, the will does not generate its own activity on its own terms, but rather is generated by an entire nexus of goods extrinsic to it. Whereas Locke understands the will primarily in terms of power, Thomas understands it in terms of attraction. And once we construe the will as power, the goods external to it must be appreciated as rivals to some degree, since they compete with the will, limiting its capacity for self-determination. But when we conceive it along Aquinas' lines, as a kind of intellectual appetite, that's his language, we grasp how goods external to the will enhance the will, allowing it to realize its ownmost nature. On the Lockean reading, we make contact with the world through an act of our own choice, thus keeping ourselves firmly in control. But on Thomas's reading, the good reaches into us and draws us up out of ourselves. Here's D.C. Schindler again, quote, "The world is always already active in me, shaping me, helping to make me who I properly am, and my will is a means by which I make this movement my own," close quote. Just as in the epistemic order, the intelligibility of the objective thing lights up the intelligence of the knower, so here in the volitional order, the goodness of the object fires the will, affecting a union between the two. The intelligible gives itself to an intelligence that gives itself back, and objective value gives itself to a desire, which then gives itself in return. On the more typically modern view, the self retains its sovereignty and essential isolation, whereas on the classical view, the intellect and will are always in relation to, and in a certain sense subordinate to the other, which calls out to them. Being with or being for is always metaphysically fundamental, which of course should not puzzle Christians who hold that the creative source of all existence is a play of relationality. These clarifications serve to illumine Serve Pinckaers, the great Dominican contemporary theologian, his well-known distinction between two understandings of freedom, namely what he calls liberté d'indifférence, liberty, freedom of indifference, and liberté de qualité, we say freedom for excellence. The first, freedom of indifference, massively on display in the culture today, is perfectly correlatable to Locke's notion of the will, for it designates liberty as a state of neutrality in the face of a variety of options, a capacity to choose free from any exterior constraint, indifférent, indifferent to the yes or the no. But the second type of freedom, usually rendered in English as freedom for excellence, makes sense within a Thomistic framework. For liberté de qualité, freedom for excellence, is not the sovereign capacity of the will towards self-determination, but rather the disciplining of desire so as to make the achievement of the good first possible and then effortless. So one becomes a free player of the piano, not by exercising arbitrary choice or staying sovereignly in control, but by subjecting oneself to the objective goods of the laws that govern the playing of that instrument. One becomes a free and fluent speaker of French, not by speaking any way that he wants, but by allowing his will to be so deeply influenced by the objective value of the French language that it becomes indeed second nature to him. Freedom for excellence, accordingly, does not stand in opposition to law. Rather, law, in a way, is the condition for its possibility. Structured good, taken into oneself through an ecstatic act of self-forgetting, is what the classical world meant by the term freedom. On Lockean grounds, or contemporary grounds in the minds of most young people today, St. Paul's holding simultaneously that he is the slave of Christ Jesus, Romans 1:1, and that Jesus has set him free, Galatians 5:1. Well, that's so much nonsense on Lockean terms. How can anyone's slave and be set free? But it's luminously clear on Thomist grounds. Now, the buffered self is a place where liking predominates over loving. For liking is utterly compatible with that narrow egocentric space. But as so many of the philosophers and spiritual teachers have intuited, authentic love tends to break through the buffered self, for it's perhaps the surest route of access to the transcendent other, whom we call God. Truly to will the good is to touch the real, as Iris Murdoch said. And to touch the real is to take the first step toward the one whom Aquinas characterizes as ens realissimum, the most real being, and that's God. Now, I'm going to make this move by following two paths. The first, a searching out of the foundations of the moral life, and the second, an exploration of the trajectory of that life. So we've broken through the buffered self with the good that galvanizes the will. Now we'll take the second step, beyond that now to the source of the good. Dietrich von Hildebrand, whose devotion to the true and the beautiful could never be called into question, nevertheless insisted that the quest for the good is the most important, more important than finding either truth or cultivating beauty. We might regret it if a person never develops a capacity for knowing high philosophical and mathematical truth, and we might lament someone never becoming an artist or an aesthete, but we would never consider either of those failures a spiritual disaster. But we would indeed think it spiritually ruinous if someone fails in the moral order. Some of the basic good theorists held to the incommensurability of those values that they recognized as fundamental: art, knowledge, sociability, etc. But this seems not to be quite right, because of the qualitative difference between the three quests for the transcendentals, there does seem to be a primacy to the good compared to the true and the beautiful. And maybe this is why Plato named the very highest reality not the form of the true, but the form of the good. It's also, I think, why John Henry Newman distinguishes between the feel that a mathematical genius might have for the most elegant form of demonstration, or the sense that an aesthete has for fine art, distinguished between those, and the moral intuition that we call conscience. Again, we might feel a certain remorse if someone lacked the first two, but we consider the lack of the third catastrophic. Newman remarks that the first two powers might be characterized as sensibilities, but the third we refer to as a voice, implying that it alone puts us into immediate contact with someone else, indeed with a person who presses upon us with an unconditioned authority, who functions as lawgiver, who finally possesses knowledge intensive and extensive enough to reach into the very deepest recesses of our interiority. Here's Newman's elegant formulation of this idea, quote, "If, as is the case, we feel responsibility, are ashamed, are frightened at transgressing the voice of conscience, this implies that there is one to whom we are responsible, before whom we are ashamed, whose claims upon us we fear." Close quote. Lest we're tempted to understand the dynamics of conscience in purely moralistic terms, Newman vividly evokes the person-to-person quality involved in hearing and responding to that voice. I'm quoting again in this gorgeous English prose here. Listen to the alliteration. This is Newman. Quote, "If on doing wrong we feel the same tearful, broken-hearted sorrow which overwhelms us upon hurting a mother, if on doing right we enjoy the same sunny serenity of mind, the same soothing, satisfactory delight which follows on our receiving praise from a father, we certainly have within us the image of some person to whom our love and veneration look, close quote. You see why Joyce called him the greatest writer of English. The German phenomenologist Max Scheler makes much the same point in his analysis of the act of repentance. Here's Scheler, I'm quoting. By the way, Karl Wojtyła did a lot of work on Max Scheler. Quote, repentance begins with an indictment. How German that sounds, by the way, compared to Newman. But before whom do we indict ourselves? Is it not then in the nature of an indictment that there should be a person who receives it and before whom the charge is laid? Repentance is furthermore an inward confession of our guilt, but to whom do we then confess? Repentance ends with a clear consciousness of the removal of guilt, but who has taken the guilt from us? What Scheler remarks here is that the sentiment of authentic shame and remorse goes far beyond a feeling of responsibility toward another human being whom we've offended. It places us, painfully of course, in the presence of the source of all moral obligation. And the experience of being truly forgiven in a similar way passes beyond whatever psychological satisfaction we might derive from receiving the benediction of another human being whom we've hurt. It introduces us into the presence of a grace coming from a transcendent place. Though both of these treatments have a rather dark tonality, I would insist that both are operating within the ambit of love. We feel ashamed upon performing a morally wrong act precisely because God has, out of love, drawn us in a particular way. And we've responded not with an answering love, but with rebellion. But even in our regret, we've entered into intimate contact with the form of the good, with the source of moral obligation, with the living God. Even as we feel remorse, we know that our journey beyond the ego has reached a qualitatively different level. Now, there's a second path which leads from the perception of the good to an experience of God, and it proceeds more teleologically than etiologically. That's to say, it's ordered toward what ultimately lures the will. Besides the famous five that he outlines at the beginning of the Summa Theologiae, Thomas Aquinas provides a number of implicit arguments for God's existence throughout his massive text. One of these can be found in the opening questions and articles of the Prima Secundae. Having determined that the will necessarily seeks the good, or at least the apparent good, Thomas appreciates how particular goods find themselves nesting within wider and wider horizons of the good. So, for example, I wrote this now many months ago. I got out of bed this morning, seeing this rising from sleep as a good, but that value I recognized is in service of the greater good of working on this Meyer lecture, which in turn is in service of the further good of addressing eventually all of you, which nests within the even greater good of propagating the truth, which activity finds itself under the aegis of the unconditioned truth, which is a supreme and consummate good, the possession of which makes me happy. Now, Thomas says we could do this with any act of the will, as simple as getting out of bed in the morning. But if I keep doing that kind of analysis, you see how the will is being drawn by the good out, to the ultimate summum bonum, the highest good of God. To speak of this summum bonum, this consummate good, is not to speak of one good, however impressive among many, but rather of the unconditioned good, which by definition exists beyond any distinction between subjectivity and objectivity. It is to speak of the properly infinite and inexhaustible good that we refer to as God. Therefore, the simple act of getting out of bed does indeed place me, at least implicitly, in the presence of God. This kind of analysis, Thomas holds, can be undertaken with any act of the will, which is precisely why he can say in that famous question 22 of the De Veritate that just as in every particular act of knowledge, God's existence is implicitly co-known, so in every particular act of the will, God's goodness is implicitly co-willed. Once again, the ecstasy involved in any true act of love, not liking, I'm in control there, but true love, willing the good of the other, it will reach its fullest expression in the total surrender to the unsurpassable good. Okay, and with that now I want to move to the beautiful, the third of the transcendentals, but I need a drink of water. Now, having seen how the first two transcendentals call the ego beyond itself, awakening an act of self-gift and self-surrender, we turn now to the last of the three, namely beauty. Ever since Hans Urs von Balthasar raised this issue many decades ago, it's widely acknowledged that the tradition has tended to overlook, or at least marginalize, this great transcendental property of being. Somehow we see it as less serious than the true and the good, perhaps a pleasant decoration which enhances the more fundamental transcendentals. Indeed, Thomas himself readily appreciates the true and the good as belonging essentially to the notion of being, since the mind grasps being as true and the will desires it as good. But though he affirms that beauty is a transcendental, his reflections on this quality in relation to being are far less direct and focused. And though I follow the traditional ordering of the transcendentals, moving from the true to the good to the beautiful, I don't want thereby to suggest that beauty is the least important. In point of fact, I would invoke a sort of liturgical hermeneutic here and declare that just as the most significant figure in the liturgical procession comes last, so here I'm placing the most important of the three in the last place. What I hope to make clear in the course of this section is that beauty, in a sense, is the most immediate, basic, and englobing of the transcendentals, that truth and goodness appear finally under its aegis. And I'll suggest this perhaps explains why commencing with the beautiful might be the most effective evangelical strategy. I found in the course of my pastoral work that beginning with the true, what one ought to believe, or with the good, how one ought to behave, is in our relativistic and subjective postmodern setting often a non-starter. But simply showing something beautiful is for most people, especially young people, less threatening, more winsome. This, I will contend, is not simply an accidental feature of our time, but rather follows from the metaphysically and epistemically basic quality of the beautiful. Perhaps the first issue we have to come to terms with is that of the objectivity of the beautiful. I think it's fair to say the default position of most in our Western culture today is that beauty is, quote, in the eye of the beholder, close quote, which is to say simply a subjective impression or response, utterly dependent upon the formation, psychology, perceptive capacity of a given recipient. If we were to seek out the sources for this widespread subjectivism, we could look to Spinoza in the 17th century and his insistence that we do not desire something because it's good, but rather we call it good in the measure that we desire it. The consequence of this is the denial that beauty is a quality of an object. I'm quoting Spinoza, but only something existing in the mind, a feeling or a mental satisfaction, close quote. But perhaps even more influential than Spinoza in this regard is the 18th century philosopher David Hume, who observed in his inquiry concerning the principles of morals that though Euclid gave a thorough account of the nature and attributes of a circle, the great geometrician never once mentioned its beauty. Hume opines the reason for this is clear. I'm quoting now, "Beauty is not a quality of the circle, but only the effect which that figure produces upon the mind," close quote. If we follow this subjectivizing line of interpretation all the way to the end, we come to the formulations of the logical positivists of the early 20th century, and others for whom, quote, "a value judgment is in reality nothing other than an exclamation." So if I say, "Oh, what a beautiful building," all I'm saying is I'm exclaiming. I'm saying nothing about the building in itself. I can only hope that people see how this trajectory of thought is conduced toward a deep impoverishment of the human spirit. I'd hope, furthermore, that they would see that this truncated understanding of beauty is analogous to the distortions of truth and goodness that we've explored above, namely data gathering and liking. For all three are conditioned by the stubborn dominance of the all-seeing and all-determining ego. Just as authentic truth and real goodness are not subject to the manipulation of the self, but rather summon the self outward, so real beauty invades the subject, stops it in place. That's why we speak of aesthetic arrest, when you're just stopped by something beautiful. It rearranges the self and sends it on mission. The tidy Spinozan and Humean accounts of beauty, which have unfortunately become the default position of so many, effectively put shackles on the soul, preventing it from achieving the unique kind of ecstasy, both thrilling and dangerous, that real beauty prompts. Dietrich von Hildebrandt's distinction between a value and a value response helps in the determination of the objectivity of beauty. Look, there's no question that things, persons, and events of great beauty elicit from us a reaction, which is simultaneously bodily, affective, and intellectual. We indeed speak of being moved by beauty or beauty penetrating to the heart. But these are the subjective responses to an objective state of affairs that prompts them, namely the truly beautiful, which is not simply satisfying for me personally, but which I recognize, here's von Hildebrandt's language, to be objectively important in itself, close quote. Whether it benefits me or not, whether it moves me more than it affects someone else, whether or not it's reverenced or despised in a given cultural moment, the Cathedral of Chartres is beautiful. By a sort of immediate intuition, we know that Chartres Cathedral is, if I can borrow the language of Augustine here, for enjoyment and not for use. I mentioned that last night. Things are useful, they're subordinate to something else. What's for enjoyment is just because there it is. There it is. There's Chartres Cathedral. Does it please me? Who cares? Does it please you? I don't care. There it is in its objectivity. How hard it is, though, for people today, everybody, to see that. I'm going to take this thing off. Its beauty is of and for itself. Its beauty is the principium, and whatever is awakened in me as a reaction is the principiatum. You know, very useful in this context is C.S. Lewis's observation in The Abolition of Man, that the feelings I have in the presence of a sublimely beautiful landscape are not themselves either beautiful or sublime. They are rather humble and grateful. And this helps to prove von Hildebrandt's point that there's a sharp distinction between an objective value and a subjective value response. At the risk of moving from the sublime to the rather ordinary, I'd invoke here an article I read many years ago in Rolling Stone magazine, in which various musicians were asked which was the first song that rocked their world. Now, I understood immediately the nature of that question. They were not inquiring after the songs that these musicians particularly liked or found entertaining. They were wondering, what was the first piece of pop music that overwhelmed their subjectivities, that changed them, that made them think about themselves and the world in a different way? In a word, they were wondering not about the subjectively satisfying, but the objectively beautiful. I knew immediately, by the way, how I would answer that question. The first song I remember liking was the Archies' Sugar Sugar. And I think it's fair to say that it's the first time that Sugar Sugar's been mentioned in a Meyer lecture. I think I'm correct in saying that. I liked that song as an 8-year-old kid, but the first pop song that rocked my world was Bob Dylan's masterpiece, Like a Rolling Stone, which I referenced last night. The former I found subjectively satisfying. The latter made me a different person. Once again, this is why the readings of beauty offered by Spinoza, Hume, and their myriad disciples on the ground today are so dangerous, frankly, because they effectively preclude or explain away the ecstatic transcendence of the self, which is prompted by real beauty, as it is by real goodness and real truth. Now, having determined the objectivity of beauty, we naturally ask the Socratic question: what precisely is beauty? Make this a little bit easier on myself. Prior to the subjectivizing moves of the modern philosophers, thinkers in the Western tradition were altogether willing to offer accounts of the beautiful. And for our purposes, it's best to perhaps to turn to Thomas Aquinas, for in many ways, he recapitulates the thinking of his philosophical predecessors. With admirable scholastic understatement, Thomas says the beautiful is quod visum placet, that which having been seen pleases. Seeing here, of course, includes more than mere visual perception, but the term nicely combines two elements that are essential, at least in our ordinary experience of beauty, namely the physical and the intellectual. We take in through our senses some object or image or melody, that is to say, some arrangement of matter. But then we perceive through our intellect a harmonious pattern or form evident in it. If we simply know this pattern through abstraction, we're dealing with truth. But when we delight in it, when it pleases us, we're dealing with the beautiful. But what exactly is it that pleases us? Quod visum placet, that which having been seen pleases. What is the patterned element in which we delight? To determine more precisely the nature of this aesthetic form, I'd recommend we turn to the 39th question of the first part of the Summa Theologiae, where Thomas provides his most thorough account of beauty. Here's Thomas Aquinas. For beauty includes three conditions: integrity or perfection, since those things which are impaired are by that fact ugly, due proportion or harmony, and lastly, brightness or clarity, whence things are called beautiful which have a bright color, close quote. An admirable account, save perhaps that last characterization of claritas as having bright color. If that were the case, we'd be hard-pressed to find most of Rembrandt's paintings beautiful. What becomes clear when we consult analogous texts in St. Thomas is that claritas has much more to do with the light of intelligibility. Whether we're talking about a beautiful face, or beautiful landscape, or beautiful symphony, even a beautiful fast break in basketball, we're noticing that it is one, that everything in it contributes to a sense of wholeness. Secondly, that all the parts that compose it are in harmonious relationship one to the other. And finally, that this unified and formal pattern shines forth delightfully. To my mind, one of the very best explications of these Thomistic qualities is found in James Joyce's autobiographical novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which I referenced last night. Joyce was carefully trained in scholastic thought and maintained a lifelong interest in it, observing once that the only real intellectual option on the table is between scholasticism and nihilism. At about the midpoint of the novel, Joyce's alter ego, the character Stephen Dedalus, engages his friend Lynch in a lively discussion around the topic presently under consideration. After citing the passage from the 39th question of the Summa, Stephen offers his commentary using the visual aid of a, quote, basket which a butcher's boy had slung inverted on his head, close quote. He commences. This is Stephen Dedalus in Joyce's novel. In order to see that basket, your mind, first of all, separates the basket from the rest of the visible universe, which is not the basket. The first phase of apprehension is a bounding line drawn about the object to be apprehended. You apprehend it as one thing. You see it as one whole. That's integritas, right? Integrity. Then, Stephen continues, you pass from point to point, led by its formal lines. You apprehend it as balanced part against part. You feel the rhythm of its structure. How great that is. You apprehend it as complex, multiple, divisible, separable, harmonious. That is consonantia, consonance. Think of any beautiful thing, a golf swing, a fast break, a face, this building. That's what we're doing, feeling the rhythm of its structure. Then he says, what do we make of claritas, the brightness of color to which Thomas refers? Stephen Dedalus concedes that for a long time, Aquinas' full meaning baffled him. And finally he came to this conclusion. I'm quoting again. When you've apprehended that basket as one thing and have then analyzed it according to its form, you make the only synthesis which is logically and aesthetically permissible. You see that it is that thing which it is and no other thing. The radiance of which he speaks is the scholastic quidditas, the whatness of the thing. Marvelous. When we sense that something is truly beautiful, isn't it true? We have a tendency to say, now that's what it's supposed to be. Now that's a golf swing. Now that's a fast break. Now that's a Gothic cathedral, right? In a strikingly noble German shepherd, we see what that breed is at its best. In an elegant golf swing, we see the very archetype of that notoriously difficult athletic move. Watching a gorgeous sunset, we might be forgiven for saying, now that is a sunset. In each case, having taken in both the wholeness and harmony of the thing, We're responding to the luminosity of its form. Hans Urs von Balthasar summed up this Thomistic analysis even more laconically than Thomas himself, commenting that beauty occurs at the intersection of species and lumen. I call it form and luminosity. By species, he means to convey what Thomas expresses by both integritas and consonantia, and by using that eloquently ambiguous term, which can designate both form and appearance. Species can mean, like, we speak of the Eucharistic species, the appearances, right? He at least implies the fact that in our immediate experience, beauty comes through the appearances mediated by the senses. And by lumen, of course, he's suggesting claritas, that peculiar radiance of form that causes delight in us as a value response. Now, with these clarifications in mind, we're in a position to understand the primordial and inclusive quality of the beautiful that I hinted at above. What is it that first gets our attention? What is it that first draws us out of ourselves in the direction of the real? I don't think it's correct to say that the true plays this role, for the abstraction of form from matter requires considerable time and detachment from the object of our contemplation. Nor does the good first beguile us, for we first have to sense that something is valuable in itself before we can appreciate that it's worth seeking for ourselves. Is it not the case that the quality which initially awakens our love, which is to say, our transcendence of self, is in fact beauty? First, we delight. First, we find something splendid. And then our attention drawn, we come to know it as true and then to seek it as good. Here's D.C. Schindler's commentary on the primordial quality of beauty. Quote, "We are suggesting that beauty is an encounter between the human soul and reality, which takes place in the meeting ground, so to speak, of appearance. Thus understood, beauty turns out to function as the foundation for all of our subsequent interaction with things in the world. It opens the horizon for there to be a world at all, and is so indispensable for proper human existence." Close quote. Von Balthasar made the marvelous and counterintuitive claim that what initially triggers in a little child the openness to something beyond his subjective desires and preoccupations, and ultimately an openness to the wider world and to the graciousness of being as such, is nothing other than the smile of his mother. First, we find our mother's smile beautiful, and all the rest follows as night follows the day. And this Balthasarian suggestion serves as a neat segue into a consideration of beauty in relation to God. As we saw in our consideration of the true and the good, the initial breakthrough of objective value into the space of subjectivity leads ineluctably to the breakthrough of transcendent value, hence rupturing the buffered self. Precisely because they are transcendental properties of being, both the good and the true serve as forerunners, harbingers of the unconditioned good and unconditioned truth. Well, the same dynamic obtains in regard to beauty. Evidence of this can be found throughout the philosophical and literary traditions. I'm going to draw attention first to two places in the Platonic corpus, namely the Diotima speech from the Symposium, and then the strange and marvelous metaphor of the wings of love we find in the Phaedrus. I'll begin with the Symposium. Don't worry, only a few more pages, don't worry. Surrounded by his colleagues at the festive table, Socrates reports an account that he attributes to the wise woman Diotima, who speaks of the initiation of a person into the way of love. He will begin, she says, Diotima, with a particular beautiful thing or person that awakens his affection. But he will perceive quickly enough that the loveliness of the individual object or body is related to any other object or body of similar loveliness. Next, he will grasp, I'm quoting now, "The beauties of the body are as nothing compared to the beauties of the soul, so that wherever he meets with spiritual loveliness, even in the husk of an unlovely body, he will find it beautiful enough to fall in love with and to cherish." Close quote. And from this, she continues, he'll be led to contemplate the beauty of laws and institutions, and from these to the sciences and to all forms of knowledge, until finally, in this beautiful, seminally important quote in our tradition. Turning his eyes toward the open sea of beauty, he will find in such contemplation the seed of the most fruitful discourse and loftiest thought, and reap a golden harvest of philosophy. How lovely, beginning with the particular beautiful, and then moving to ever higher forms of beauty, until finally looking out to the open sea of the beautiful itself. That trajectory haunted the Western tradition. This gazing toward the open ocean of the beautiful itself corresponds precisely to the former denizen of the cave, remember from last night, looking with squinting eyes toward the sun and realizing he's found the source of all goodness and beauty. The second great Platonic trope for this relationship between beauty of the individual and the beauty of heaven is found in the Phaedrus, that marvelous dialogue. In accord with his musings in the Meno and elsewhere, Socrates holds that all of us originally inhabited the realm of the forms, and there we were outfitted with wings to fly to the heights of contemplation. At our birth, as he tells this sort of mythic tale, at our birth we fell into matter, and though we lost our wings in the process, their roots remain embedded in our shoulders. It's strange, but kind of a striking image. And when we see a beautiful person, this is Plato, we commence to shudder with awe, as if in the presence of a god, and then to sweat. Now listen, I'm quoting. For by reason of the stream of beauty entering in through his eyes, there comes a warmth, whereby his soul's plumage is fostered, and with that warmth, the roots of the wings are melted, which for long had been so hardened and closed up that nothing could grow. Now, I know it's a bit fanciful, but doesn't it give you the sense of what it feels like when you're in the presence of someone or something or some event that's really beautiful? It makes you want to fly. And I don't mean that just in an emotional way. It makes you want to fly up into the realm of the forms, to fly to the source of beauty. We do not simply exult in the splendor of what we're seeing. We feel the impulse to fly. For by a powerful intuition, we're drawn from that particular beauty to the source of beauty. The Platonic metaphors find a marvelous contemporary correlate in Joyce's account in The Portrait of the Artist. I've already quoted from it. But the even more famous passage in that novel of Stephen's encounter with the young woman standing in the surf just off of Sandymount Strand in Dublin. The character at that point is in deep depression and anxiety, and he's kind of lost, and what's my life all about? And he's wandering, typical Irish, I get it, wandering on the beach. And then listen, a girl stood before him in midstream, alone and still, gazing out to sea. Ah, Diotima. We're gonna gazing out to the sea of the open sea of the beautiful, right? There she was, alone and still, gazing out to sea. Her long, slender legs were delicate as a crane's. Her slate blue skirts were kilted boldly about her waist and dovetailed behind her. Her long, fair hair was girlish and touched with the wonder of mortal beauty her face. Well, because she's alone and still, silhouetted by the sea, Stephen can see her as one and perfect, separated from all that might compete for his attention. In a word, integritas is on display. Then, what did we hear in that description? But his careful following of the rhythm of her structure, noticing how the various parts of her body and pieces of clothing relate to one another and to the composite. Consonantia has emerged. Next, the aesthetic arrest which allows for the perception of the radiance of form is described. I'm quoting again. And when she felt his presence and the worship of his eyes, her eyes turned to him in quiet sufferance of his gaze, without shame or wantonness. Long, long she suffered his gaze, and then quietly withdrew her eyes from his. Like a medieval maiden sought by a troubadour, she allows him to worship, but at a proper distance, and she feels no shame because she knows his look is not for the purpose of possession, but rather of contemplation. Finally, this aesthetic regard and attitude permit the growth of the wings, undoubtedly signaled by our hero's last name. His name's peculiarly, his name is Stephen Daedalus. Where's that come from? Daedalus, but he's the maker of wings in ancient mythology. See, Joyce knew this great tradition from Dante back to Plato, and he knew the looking out to the open sea, and he knew about the growth of the wings when we see something beautiful. It's all there. It's all there. Like Diotima's hero, Stephen and the girl gaze out together to the open sea of the beautiful itself, and the young man then acknowledges that the connection to transcendence has been accomplished. At the end of his speech, here's what he says: "Heavenly God," cried Stephen's soul in an outburst of profane joy. That's Joyce's commentary. That's how it works, everybody. That the authentically beautiful, once we take it in and we learn how to take it in, causes the wings to grow. And it causes us finally to look out to the open sea of the beautiful itself. And this Joyce, with a deeply ambiguous relationship to the church, but nevertheless, his great hero could say, "Heavenly God," at the terminus of this experience. And Joyce himself, he's telling us how he became a writer. That's how he became a writer. And he said, "My job is now to report epiphanies." And that's what he does, moments when the divine breaks through in the beauty of the world. These marvelous accounts give expression to something that many of us feel in the presence of beauty, but can't articulate. How beautiful faces, events, objects, and songs can transport us to a higher dimension of reality. Von Hildebrand speaks in this context of, quote, "beauty of the second power," close quote. This is a loveliness that goes far beyond whatever harmony and integrity we might expect in a given physical arrangement. A melody might indeed be beautiful in itself, but somehow its humble notes point beyond themselves to a transcendent beauty. Here's von Hildebrand. Beauty of the second power, kindles in us a yearning for the world of lofty, immaterial realities. Basically, this is a longing for that which is above us, quae sursum sunt. It draws us upward. Okay, this paper is already a little on the lengthy side, and I'm just going to close with a couple of practical remarks. That truth breaks through the buffered self should certainly lead Catholic catechists, teachers, professors, evangelists to stop dumbing down the faith. I talked about this last night. To start embracing a smart, intellectually informed apologetics. I've heard at times in the Catholic commentariat the view that one should prefer accompaniment, Pope Francis' word, over apologetics. This is a beautiful example of a false dichotomy. For I can assure you that anyone who thinks that young people especially do not have myriad questions about the faith has not accompanied many young people. But more than this, Catholic educators and formators at all levels should help their charges see that any engagement with the truth can and should lead ultimately to God. And may I suggest a stress should be placed on mathematics and the physical sciences, since these are seen by most people today as paradigmatic vehicles for understanding the truth. Let your students understand that these disciplines lead them out of the cave and toward an experience of the invisible dimension of reality, indeed, to the very threshold of the divine. Of course, there isn't a Catholic mathematics or physics, but there is indeed a Catholic context for the study of these subjects. Teach it to your students. That's the kind of summary of the talk last night. Knowing that the good breaks through the buffered self, Catholic leaders and educators should stand athwart ethical relativism and show how an acknowledgement of objective moral value is implied in the intense political and social commitments of so many in our culture. Though most young people today assume a subjectivist position regarding sexual matters, they're anything but relativist when it comes to moral causes they take seriously. Does any vocal social activist today hold that racism, sexism, the oppression of the poor, homophobia are simply matters of private opinion or subjective positions that one may or may not adopt? Well, the question answers itself. So we should start with these acknowledgments of objective moral value and then press in both etiological, where they come from, and teleological directions, where they're going, inviting people to search out the ultimate source and trajectory of these convictions. Finally, knowing that the beautiful ruptures the buffered self, Catholic leaders and formators should find ever more creative ways to use our splendid aesthetic tradition in evangelization. As hinted above, for many people today, the beautiful is a less threatening transcendental than the good and the true. So start with the beautiful. A vivid exemplification of this truth can be found in Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited. The narrator, Charles Ryder, is a cool agnostic and a budding painter who commences his long journey toward the church with an experience of the overwhelming beauty of the manor house Brideshead, which functions throughout the novel as a symbol of the church. Drawn in by its loveliness, Charles in time comes to appreciate the moral demand and then the truth also present within the walls of that place. The movement was from the beautiful to the good and finally to the true. I found that much the same dynamic obtains in the learning of a sport. First, a young person finds the game splendid, beautiful to watch, and this awakens an intense desire to play. And finally, having played, he comes to know the rules and rhythms that govern the game from the inside. Ewart Cousins, who served twice as Paulic theologian here at Mundelein Seminary, once commented to me that the particular genius of Catholicism is that, quote, we never threw anything out, close quote. He meant that we have more or less, there have been exceptions, but more or less resisted the iconoclastic tendency, which sadly presents itself with some regularity up and down the centuries. We've tended to keep and savor the beautiful, and this is of supreme evangelical importance. I'd encourage Catholic catechists and evangelists to learn our aesthetic tradition well. I'd encourage Catholic artists and architects to make beautiful things. I'd encourage liturgists to make of the Mass the courtyard of heaven. Recent surveys consistently reveal that what disaffiliated Catholics remember with particular affection is the beauty of the religion that they abandoned. We should take that very seriously. Buffering the self from contact with God is a moral and spiritual disaster. The regnant secular society has no interest, of course, in addressing this problem. But the churches, especially the Catholic Church, I would say, are the privileged means by which this buffering can be undone. The good, the true, and the beautiful are our best tools. Let's use them. God bless you all. Thanks for listening. Thank you. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Bishop Barron. Our first respondent this morning is Dr. Patricia Pintado Murphy. Dr. Pintado is assistant professor in the Department of Pre-Theology here at Mundelein Seminary. She holds a doctorate in philosophy from the Catholic University of America, as well as a licentiate in philosophy from the University of Navarra. Prior to joining the faculty at Mundelein, she served as assistant professor of philosophy at the Pontifical College Josephinum and assistant professor of philosophy at DeSales University. She also taught in the Religious Studies Department of Catholic University during graduate school. Dr. Pintado directed a program on the new evangelization at the Athenaeum of Ohio, and she currently serves as managing editor of the Josephinum Journal of Theology. She has published scholarly articles on modern philosophy, its impact on the relationship between faith and reason, and its influence on theology and the nature of secularization, particularly following the thought of Cornelio Fabro and Joseph Ratzinger. She also is interested in the history and experience of Hispanics in the Catholic Church in the United States. So let us offer a warm welcome to Dr. Pintado.
Good morning. Just on an anecdote to begin with, I wanted to thank our rector, John Carchi, for giving me the opportunity to answer to Bishop Barron's lecture. And I have to confess, my first reaction was to text Father Brandon and ask him, more or less say, I feel like David and Goliath. And Father Lupton responded, "You're Goliath, right?" Bishop Barron offers a powerful analysis of the human condition in contemporary culture by relying on Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. My brief response will first offer an overview of Taylor's terms to further illumine the question of what the buffered self is. Second, I will address Bishop Barron's diagnosis to answer the question of why this self is in crisis. Finally, I will offer some complementary suggestions to answer the question of how to help our buffered selves. According to Taylor, the cultural shift from an enchanted to a disenchanted world gave rise to exclusive humanism. The self becomes the buffered self who is closed off from outside forces and focuses exclusively on the immanent world as opposed to the transcendent world. Taylor calls exclusive humanism the attitude that allows the buffered self to create or find meaning through its own means. This self inhabits the immanent frame, a constructed social space that frames our lives entirely within a natural rather than supernatural order. But within this immanent frame, the person still senses a longing for transcendence. The desire for the spiritual endures, triggered by dissatisfaction with a life constrained by the mere search of material satisfaction. In our postmodern world, we're living in what Taylor calls the age of authenticity, where spirituality is alive as a quest. One has to find one's own faith, yearning for experiences of fulfillment. Given that we are emotivists, as Alistair McIntyre explained in his version of the modern self, emotions and personal choices are what convey meaning. How we think and what we do is determined by the things we like and thus what we choose. This is what Bishop Barron refers to as well as the culture of self-invention, which consists in one's capacity to determine through freedom the meaning of one's life. Taylor argues, quote, that all options are equally worthy because they're freely chosen, and it is choice that confers worth, end quote. This assessment coincides with Bishop Barron's awareness of how unlimited choice is a must for the generation of the nuns. In sum, the key question posed by Taylor is if one can find fulfillment without God. Having elucidated Taylor's understanding of the buffered self, I will briefly turn to Bishop Barron, highlighting some of his key insights. 1, the culture has given rise to the loss of religious commitment. 2, the good life can be had apart from any relationship to a transcendent reality. 3, scientism, ideological materialism, and the self-invention culture are cutting us off of a living connection to the transcendent. And finally, the secularist ideology is soul-killing, and the human heart quite naturally rebels against it. As a way out, Bishop Barron beautifully describes Plato's emancipated prisoner. This is the religious person making his or her way through the secularized world of today, moving among the buffered selves. To accomplish the liberation of the self, Bishop Barron relies on Dietrich von Hildebrand and Iris Murdoch. To situate Barron's contribution, let me quote Tracy Rowland's overview of the different critiques of modernity. Quote, most post-conciliar generation scholars are familiar with the many critiques of modernity from theological and sociological perspectives, end of quote. She lists the example of Alistair McIntyre, Charles Taylor, Hans Brumberg, Eric Vogelin, and the Radical Orthodoxy reading presented by Catherine Pickstock and John Milbach. There is a common agreement that this culture developed in opposition to the medieval theologically, especially Thomistic synthesis. Bishop Barron follows in the footsteps of von Balthasar, who saw the severance of the relationship between the true, the beautiful, and the good as the central pathological, this is the expression of Tracy Lowland, as the central pathological feature of the new culture. For the sake of brevity, I will simply highlight Bishop Barron's insight into the first transcendental, the truth. He's spot on when he states that the postmodern sense of truth is information. Information is knowledge about something, as distinct from direct acquaintance, as Stacy Schindler states. A second mark that he explained to us was that information is shaped by transferability. I can receive, change, manipulate, and send this data everywhere. Bishop Barron turns to Aquinas to explain that real knowledge of another thing or person puts the subject in a far more receptive mode. Quote, the ego is not in control, but rather invited into openness and responsiveness to another, end of quote. He points to David Tracy's insight that the very disciplines that, in the minds of many today, most root us in the empirical order, in point of fact, lift us beyond it to the invisible order. And as Bishop Barron concludes, quote, if even the simplest acts of real knowledge, and not simply the gathering information, involve self-transcendence, we see now that this is only an invitation to the radical loss of self, coming to know the intelligence behind the intelligibility, end of quote. Now I come to the third section of my talk. As a way of conclusion, I will attempt to indicate some complementary suggestions to answer the question, how to help our buffered selves. I will address the themes of friendship, community, and witness on the one hand, and the obstacles to believe in God that arise in contemporary culture, but are caused by the deformation of Christianity due to Protestantism and some failures of our own church on the other hand. And I said we buffered selves because as Christians we are part of this postmodern world, heirs of modernity, benefactors of rights. We're not immune to the cultural trends described by Charles Taylor and Bishop Barron. We could speak of a divided self. Living out the faith is sometimes reduced to worship on Sunday and to preserving moral values in the family. And still, how we work or how we use friends for pleasure or utility seems to be shaped by the common goals of the secular world: success, security, money, fame. My first suggestions follows from my early study of Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics and my life experience, namely the importance of friendship. I'm not challenging the greatness of the Catholic intellectual tradition. In terms of diagnosis, Bishop Barron's philosophical insights are superb, particularly if the audience are highly educated atheists or agnostic intellectuals, and committed Catholics whom Bishop Barron enlightened so well through his ministry on Word on Fire. But I want to emphasize the importance of friendship in reaching out to those alienated from the faith. They are often not ready for a philosophical argument because, as David Brooks and Jordan Peterson have shown us, any attempt at relationship passes through our emotions, our experiences, our frailties. To engage the isolated, buffered self of the nuns and overcome their suspicion or their indifference towards religion, we may simply show care and concern, be attentive to the history, and be very, very patient as we walk together. As Monsignor Luigi Giussani loved to quote from Reinhard Niebuhr, quote, nothing is so unconvincing as the answer to a question that has not been posed. Taylor argues that believers need a new way of, quote, inhabiting their faith, quote, end of quote. He calls for an honest and authentic faith, genuinely open to the other. We need to learn to be sympathetic and understanding towards people and positions different than our own. Quote, where you really have a desire to know what it is like to be the other person and live their kind of spiritual life. End of quote. This is what Edith Stein would call empathy. According to Ratzinger, quote, the heart first enlightens the understanding. This is how thought also begins to see, through love. This is why faith does not arise from understanding, but from hearing. Fides ex audito, Romans 10:17, end of quote. Why are many close towards the transcendence? What makes immanence appealing? Taylor puts forward various reasons: dislike of religious fanaticism, progress of the natural sciences and the benefits of technology that claim to explain everything, focus on the transcendent is accused as betraying this earthly sensual life, according to Martha Nussbaum, and the exclusive concern with human needs. Call it consumerism or materialism that numbs the person to seek higher goals. And still the question remains if there is something more beyond the immanent world, according to Taylor. In our zeal, we would love to share the truth about Christianity, but in light of these obstacles, those alienated from the faith have to first trust us, and then they may ask why we're different. In this age of authenticity, the nones will be struck if our humanity has been transformed. Our friendship with the nones may help them change because we ourselves have changed by our friendship with Christ. This leads me to the second suggestion, community. The new liberated self, and this is not too harsh of a critique, but the new liberated self that Bishop Barron describes seems to be leaving the cave by himself or herself and seems to stay alone. But Christ says that we will be recognized by the way we love each other. Or as Ratzinger affirms, quote, love for Christ and of one's neighbor for Christ's sake can enjoy stability and consistency only if its deepest motivation is love for the truth. Love, the center of Christian reality, is at the same time eros for truth, and only so does it remain sound as agape for God and man. End of quote. Edith Stein suggested that those who live with Holy Church can never be lonely. They find themselves, quote, embedded in the great human community. Everywhere all are united as brothers and sisters in the depth of their hearts. And because streams of living water flow from all those who live in God's hand, they exert a mysterious magnetic appeal on thirsty souls. Without aspiring to it, they must become guides of other persons striving to the light. End of quote. Or in the words of Pope Francis, quote, each community is called to create a God-enlightened space in which they can experience the hidden presence of the risen Lord. End of quote. Young people could be awakened to the presence of the Lord in the pursuit of the common good and through acts of solidarity within a community, and so begin to challenge their buffered selves. After all, Flannery O'Connor said, quote, when you start to think of other people's problems and stop thinking of your own, you have found Christ. End of quote. According to Bishop Barron, the nones are anything but relativists when it comes to moral causes that they take seriously, particularly social justice and the environment. The empathy that lies at the heart of social justice and environmental causes is the essence of community. Tied to the idea of friendship and community, Taylor calls for recovery of an incarnational Christianity and the power of the witnesses. He mentions a variety of remarkable people, from Therese of Lisieux to Teresa of Calcutta, and especially Charles Péguy. The witnesses of converts also help to show that, quote, the Christian faith can be lived better and more fully, end of quote, as people seek to growth in truth. The saints are not to be forgotten among the cloud of witnesses, who, according to Taylor, quote, have radiated some sense of direct contact with fullness. This broad cloud of witnesses of faith had an encounter with God's power and love, and we reach out to the nuns in communion with them. Finally, and in responding to the problem of the buffered cells, we have to face the obstacles that the Church has erected by failing to live out the incarnation of Christianity. We cannot summarize here 300 pages of Taylor's narration of the impact of modernity on Christianity and the Church. So it will have to suffice to quote Cardinal Francis George's famous statement during the Synod of Bishops for the Americas in November of 1997. He said that U.S. citizens are, quote, culturally Calvinist, even those who profess the Catholic faith, end of quote. This Calvinism translates in other isms that we can just mention in passing now: fideism, deism, legalism, moralism, individualism. So how has Christianity changed from the late Middle Ages to the present? Taylor discusses the shift to a more inward and internal personal devotion, an uneasiness with sacramental religion, and the idea of salvation by faith. This contributes to the buffering self in America. From his way of reading Scripture, Calvin rejected the sacramentality espoused by the Catholic Church, which he ridiculed as magic, since he thought that it does not change Christians or help them obtain God's salvation. This too contributed to the buffering self. The Reformation's fear of idolatry, moreover, brought an emptying of the spiritual life through a process of excarnation. So Taylor goes on to say that as far as to state that the Protestant Reformation was the main engine of disenchantment, and thus of buffered self, especially in its Calvinist expression. Turning briefly to some challenges facing our Catholic Church, I'm reminded of T.S. Eliot's question in Chorus in the Rock. Quote, "Is it the Church that has abandoned humanity, or has humanity abandoned the Church?" End of quote. Taylor asserts that Vatican II repudiated clericalism, moralism, and a pastoral policy of fear. End of quote. We could contest his observation, but I suspect that some of the factors that led the nuns to abandon the Church have to do with these. Recent research of the Springtime Institute states that 52% of young people have little to no trust in organized religion. While, yes, the beautiful paths Bishop Barron has outlined are further ways to open the buffered self, our witness has to begin from our own transformation because of an encounter. Here I am drawn to what Pope Francis says in Evangelium Gaudium. Quote, "I never tire of repeating these words of Benedict XVI, which take us to the very heart of the gospel." And this is Benedict. "Being a Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction." End of quote. It is through the witness of disciples that the nuns can encounter Christ again. Recall the words attributed to Teresa of Avila. "Christ has no hands but yours, no mouth but yours." End of quote. Others encounter Christ through the witness of the living testimony of his disciples. Bishop Barron correctly alerts us to the false dichotomy of preferring accompanying over apologetics. Indeed, apologetics is not opposed to accompanying, But evangelization is more than apologetics. In other words, a witness identified by non-religious persons or those who have fallen away as an authentic way of life may be the first way of entry to build a friendship, invite them to a community, something that young people today are craving, and encountering the person of Christ in others. Ideas, philosophy, doctrine will reinforce that encounter. As Ratzinger taught us, quote, "Indeed, in the person of Jesus appears the perfect dialogue itself between God and humanity. Through our experience of Christ, we come to know God, who is not only logos, but also dia-logos." End of quote. Also, finally, as Christus Vivid number 212 indicates, quote, and this is now Francis, "Any educational project or path of growth for young people must certainly include formation in Christian doctrine and morality. It is likewise important that it has two main goals. One is the development of the kerygma, the foundational experience of encounter with God through Jesus' death and resurrection. The other is growth in fraternal love, community life, and service. In the words of Romano Guardini, when we experience a great love, everything else becomes part of it." Thank you.
Thank you to Dr. Pintado. We'll have one more talk, and then we'll give Bishop Barron an opportunity to respond to both respondents. Our second respondent this morning is Father Brendan Lupton, an alumnus of the University of St. Mary of the Lake. Father Lupton is a priest of the Archdiocese of Chicago. He was ordained in 2005. A patristic theologian, he earned a sacred theology doctorate in historical theology at Catholic University of America in 2013. He has served on the Mundelein faculty for 9 years and currently is president of the pontifical faculty. Father Lupton is author of the book St. Paul as an Exemplar of Holiness and Pastoral Leadership in the Writings of Pope Gregory the Great, published by Edwin Mellon Press. He also has published scholarly articles in several journals, including Chicago Studies, Downside Review, and Studia Patristica. So let us offer a warm welcome to Father Lupton.
As Dr. Barrett mentioned, I'm an alumnus of Mundelein Seminary. One of the great graces of my life is I was privileged to have Bishop Barron as a professor. And oftentimes people will ask me, what was it like to have Bishop Barron as a teacher? And my usual response usually is, I never looked at my watch during class. So I know generations of priests are indebted to Bishop Barron for instilling in them a love of our great tradition. Before beginning this response, I would like to thank Bishop Barron for his excellent lecture and his insightful and clear diagnosis of the current culture and his proposals of how the church might engage the nuns, especially via the way of beauty. It's my hope that my response might be able to supplement Bishop Barron's argument of how we might engage the nuns. To do so, I'd like to focus on another challenging moment in the history of Christian evangelization. That is, from the apostolic age until the rise of Constantine in 312 AD. The purpose of examining this moment will be to propose another way to evangelize the nuns. Bishop Barron focused on the great transcendentals, which call the ego out of itself. I would like to focus on another way to engage them through the lessons of the early church. This method is summarized well in the famous Latin phrase, Historia est magistra vitae. History is the teacher
of life. In short, early Christian evangelization efforts can help us navigate our own current mission to engage the nones and disaffiliated. Although the first few Christian centuries were vastly different from our own, nevertheless, the early Christians faced a far more difficult situation than we do today. They also achieved a type of success that we would long for. Historians argue that the number of Christians from the apostolic age until the 4th century grew at the rate of 40% per decade. This type of growth is staggering, considering their overwhelming challenges. To contextualize these challenges, let us consider for a moment what Christians were up against in around the year 200. During this period, historians conjecture there were 200,000 Christians in the Roman Empire, which was under 1% of the population of about 60 million. Since there were so few, they had little resources. A single copy of the Septuagint would have been a tremendous luxury for a small Christian community. There was no public churches, few works of Christian art, very few works of Christian literature. In fact, one could argue that pagans had the way of beauty on their side. Various pagan shrines and temples dotted the Roman world. They also had the culture. Not only did Christians have scant resource, but pagans who even knew about Christianity considered it odd, strange, and bizarre. Take a look at this graffiti, which was discovered in some soldier barracks in 1857 on the Palatine Hill in Rome. And Brian, you can turn on the slide. There we go. Can people see that in the back? No, okay. Not surprised. Here's another view of it. Let's see if this works. Can you see it? So this graffiti was discovered in Palatine Hill in Rome in 1857. This graffiti is thought to be from around the early 3rd century, around 200 AD. The inscription reads, Alexamenos worships his god, in rather crude Greek. It's believed that it was meant to mock Alexamenos, most likely a soldier, for being a Christian. In fact, the raised arm was a symbol of homage or worship. This graffiti is the earliest known pictorial representation of the crucifixion of Jesus. It captures well what Romans would have thought of the idea of Christianity in the first place. A crucified and weak God does not make sense. Gods were powerful, did what they pleased, and certainly would not succumb to the worst punishment on earth. This type of God is more of an ass than a god for a Roman. This summer, I was talking to an alumnus of Mundelein Seminary who had me several years ago in class, and he was telling me that this was the one thing that he remembered from my class, this image, which I found consoling and a little disconcerting as well. Besides this representation of some early pagans' impressions of the new faith, the first pagan written source to refer to Christianity is Pliny's letter to Trajan, penned in 111 AD. On this occasion, a local magistrate, Pliny in Bithynia, modern-day Turkey, wrote to the Emperor Trajan to find out how he should deal with this small group called the Christians. Should he hunt them out? Should he leave them alone? In this letter, Pliny refers to Christianity not as a religio, but as a superstitio. The difference would be similar today to the distinction between a major world religion, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and a fanatical cult. For pagans, Christians were members of a deviant cult. In fact, the great N.T. Wright explained that if one were to become a Christian during this early period, it would be akin to going off the grid today and giving up every form of technology. The gods at this time were involved in every aspect of one's life, from sowing to farming to soldiering. To renounce the gods was a radical rejection of common pagan life. It seems strange and bizarre. The graffiti and brief quotation from Pliny's letter provide two snapshots of how pagans viewed early Christianity. Yet the number of Christians grew How did they do so? An immediate retort, however, is that the conversion of Constantine led to massive conversions. This was a watershed moment. However, historians admit that even if Constantine had not seen the blazing Chi Rho in the heavens, Christianity still would have become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire based on its rate of growth of 40% per decade. Given these overwhelming odds and Christianity's success, we ask, how did they succeed? This question has fascinated both theological and historical luminaries since the 4th century. St. Augustine speculated that, quote, Christianity must have reproduced itself by means of miracles, for the greatest miracle of all would have been the extraordinary extension of the religion apart from any miracle, end quote. In short, grace and the power of God must have been at work. In his famous 18th century work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Edward Gibbon argued that pagans had tired of the Greek and Roman gods and thirsted for a more robust faith, which Christianity supplied. Specifically, Gibbon added that Christianity promised eternal life, worked miracles, and introduced intolerant zeal, all of which led to its success. In the early 20th century, Alfred von Harnack speculated that people were attracted to Christianity because of its emphasis on spiritual and physical healing. This paper is not the place to analyze these various theories. Rather, I'd like to focus on the work of Rodney Stark, a historian and sociologist who has written extensively on early Christian mission. In fact, he's devoted most of his academic work to this question. His analysis will supplement Bishop Barron's presentation, provide some inspiration for those in the trenches of the church's evangelical mission. And for this presentation, I would like to focus on two subjects within Stark's work: his social conversion theory and evangelization through plagues. Social conversion. As mentioned, Stark is a sociologist. Thus, unlike the theology of Augustine and historical approach of Gibbon, he approached the question of Christianity's growth as a scientist. First, he wanted to watch people convert to new and deviant religious movements, theorize about the process, and then test if similar dynamics of patterns occurred in the early Christian years. At first blush, this methodology seems difficult to execute, since in the first few centuries, there were no surveys, Pew Research studies, or October counts. There are gaps in our knowledge, and this must be acknowledged before setting forth his findings. As mentioned, first Stark desired to study people committing to a new and deviant faith, since, of course, Christianity was one at its inception. In the mid-1960s, he learned of a new cult which people were beginning to join, the Moonies, or the Unification Church, founded in 1954 in Seoul by the late Sung Ming Moon. The Moonies have 1 to 2 million members today. Allow me to summarize briefly the beginning of this faith. In the early 1960s, a certain young Korean woman, young Kim, immigrated from Korea to the U.S. to start a branch of the Moonies on U.S. soil. Dr. Kim had been a professor of religion in Seoul. At first, Dr. Kim attempted, quote, to spread her message directly by talks to various groups and by sending out many press releases, by radio spots, and by renting a hall in which to hold public meetings. But these methods yielded nothing, end quote. Eventually, however, Kim recruited some new initiates. The first were all young housewives who lived in Kim's neighborhood. Kim rented a room in one of their homes and was able to recruit the property owner, who then recruited some of her neighbors. Stark notes that the group, quote, never succeeded in attracting a stranger, end quote. Remaining with this pattern, the additional initiates were friends of one or more of the Moonies. From these observations and others, Stark concluded that, quote, conversion to a new deviant religious groups occurs when, other things being equal, people have or develop strong attachments to members of the group than they have to non-members. This conclusion, he explains, has been confirmed in numerous other sociological studies on conversion to deviant faiths. In short, people are much more likely to convert to a new deviant faith when they develop more social ties within the group than outside of it. From this premise, Stark notes two important corollaries. First, if a person has strong social ties to a major religion, it's unlikely that he or she will convert to a new deviant cult. The uncommitted, however, are far more likely to convert. Quote, converts to new religious movements, Stark explains, are overwhelmingly from relatively irreligious backgrounds. The majority of converts to modern American cult movements report that their parents had no religious affiliation. Along these lines, today's nuns present a tremendous evangelical opportunity since they are disaffiliated from any religious group and therefore do not have any social ties to a particular faith. The second corollary is that successful movements, that is, deviant cults, discover techniques for remaining open networks, able to reach out into the new adjacent social networks. When he uses the term social network, he does not mean something like Facebook or Twitter, but rather a community of individuals, united via friendship and relations. In other words, if a religious group is self-contained, it will die. Religions must be plugged into various communities of people to experience growth. Now, at this point, one might ask, is conversion to a new deviant faith only based on relationships and not faith or even truth? Are religions merely social clubs? Stark explains that usually new converts begin to adhere to the doctrines of the deviant faith after conversion. You might say that the doctrines drew them in, but usually the social ties led them into the new faith, according to sociological studies. Stark writes, quote, after conversion has occurred is when most people get more deeply involved in the doctrines of their group, end quote. In some sense, this sequence follows a post-liberal understanding of the acquisition of truth, in which a certain culture facilitates the apprehension of truth. The example that Bishop Barron often uses to explain this dynamic is learning how to play the game of baseball. A person does not learn by merely watching or reading about baseball. A person learns to play by playing. Similar vein, especially when people enter into the game of a new deviant faith, then they learn and understand its teaching. Having studied the dynamics of conversion to deviant faith, Stark examined early Christianity to see if relationships also played a significant role. Before examining his results, again, it should be repeated that the first and second centuries did not have Pew Research studies, and there are gaps in our knowledge. When examining the apostolic work of St. Paul, Stark was able to discern traces of social conversion in the Acts of the Apostles. He notes that, quote, Paul did not rush from place to place, leaving a trail of converts. Instead, he spent more than 2 years building a Christian group in Ephesus, 18 months in Corinth, several years in Antioch. And many historians believe his stays in some other places were considerably longer. The apostle remained so long in these cities in order to get to know the citizens, to form friendships, to form small Christian communities. Along similar lines, N.T. Wright makes an interesting observation concerning Paul's day job. Quote, the apostle spent most of his waking hours with his sleeves rolled up, doing hard physical work in a hot climate, and that perhaps 2/3 of the conversations he had with people about Jesus and the gospel were not conducted in a place of worship or study, not even in a private home, but in a small, cramped workshop. Such an informal setting is ideal for forming friendship and trust. Another historian of early Christianity, Bart Ehrman, who should be read with caution, observes that when Luke mentions a household conversion, that is, when an entire household converts to Christianity in the book of Acts, he connotes they were quite common. Household conversions, are recorded in the books of Acts, quote, as a matter of course, as if there was nothing at all unusual about members of a household joining the paterfamilias or even the materfamilias in the faith. And so when Paul and his companions were in Philippi, they converted a wealthy woman named Lydia, and immediately she and her household were baptized. Soon after, an unnamed jailer learned he must believe in Jesus to be saved, and he and his entire family were baptized without delay. The author of Acts saw nothing at all unusual in an entire family joining the new faith. Sure, it seems that Luke's expressions imply that these types of conversions were common. Besides familial conversions, Luke also recounts conversions through friendship in Acts 10, when St. Peter baptized Cornelius, his relatives and close friends. In each of these cases, members of the household or friends convert to Christianity through social and familial ties. Although these are isolated instances, the great historian of late antiquity, Peter Brown, supplements Ehrman's observation and writes, "Ties of family, marriages, and loyalties to heads of household have been the most effective means of recruiting members of the church and had maintained the continued adherence of the average Christian to the new cult." End quote. Suppose for a moment, however, that someone in one of these households was reticent to convert, since he or she might have had a previous attachment to a pagan god, whom now he or she must renounce. How would Christianity compare to his or her current religious life? The theologian and patristic scholar Boniface Ramsey explains that, quote, "Early Christianity distinguished itself from the paganism of the time by its firm belief in the possibility of a tender intimacy with the divine, an intimacy that went not only from man to God, but that was believed to go as well from God to man." In short, Christianity turned the religious world upside down. A pagan was required to pay homage and devotion to a god since the god demanded it. The relationship did not commence with the god's love of the individual. In fact, scholars have noted that outside of the scriptures, the Greek verbs agapein and philein, both meaning to love, are never used to describe a God's love for humankind. On the contrary, their adherents are supposed to agapein and philein the gods. They do not love their subjects in return. Imagine for a moment hearing this startling discovery. The one God loves humanity. This must have melted their hearts. Along these lines, St. Leo the Great in the 5th century writes, "It is far less amazing that human beings should progress upwards towards God than that God should have come down to the human level." End quote. Peter Brown speculates that one of the reasons why people rioted over Christological issues was that when the position was unorthodox, they felt that the love of God for humanity expressed in Christ Jesus had been removed. In other words, if Jesus were a mere man, God's love for humanity would not be embodied in Christ himself. This compelling nature of Christian teaching reveals that it was not just a social club, but something that melted people's hearts and reversed their world. Unfortunately, today, God's love for humanity has become a platitude and lost its power that it would have had to those early Christians. Having reviewed Stark's social theory of conversion and some examples from Acts of the Apostles, one could argue that the real catalyst for conversion was St. Paul in his preaching. This is true. The apostle preached the kerygma. Someone converted, the household and friends followed suit. Without the words of Paul, no Gentile would have entered this deviant faith. The social ties were secondary agents, but nevertheless played a significant role. The second point. Evangelization through plagues. After the apostolic age, that is, after all the apostles had died, Christianity entered a new chapter of evangelization. At this point, the church did not have an evangelization strategy or even many evangelists. In fact, history chronicles only a few: Gregory the Wonder Worker, a few nameless preachers in Egypt, and eventually Martin of Tours. The historian Ramsay McMullen writes, quote, "After St. Paul, the church had no mission. It had no organized or official approach to unbelievers." In other words, it had no official or organized approach on the whole. So how did Christianity still grow? Stark speculates that, ironically, plagues might have assisted in evangelization. In 165, a horrible plague struck the Roman Empire and persisted for 15 years. Barely after the people recovered in 251, another epidemic multiplied throughout the empire. During both of them, a quarter or a third of the population died, including the famous emperor Marcus Aurelius in 180 in Vienna. Pagans and Christians responded differently to these epidemics. Since many of the large cities were more or less petri dishes because of cramped living spaces and poor sanitation, most citizens knew enough to flee. Many Christians, however, remained in the cities to care for the sick. In 260, the Bishop of Alexandria, Dionysius, chronicled what happened during the second plague and disclosed three important events. First, he explains that Christians remained to care for the sick in the city. Quote, "Most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ." End quote. Second, the pagans, the bishop reveals, did the opposite and left. Quote, "The heathen behaved in the opposite way." Third, he implied that Christians had a higher rate of survival. Quote, "Its full impact fell on the heathen." End quote. So why would a higher percentage of Christians survive? Clearly, they didn't have better medicine. Stark proposes several reasons. First, possibly some Christians might have acquired immunity because of early exposure to the virus. Second, as Stark explains, modern medical experts believe that conscientious nursing without any medication could cut the mortality rate by 2/3 or more. Nourishment and water could assist a person to battle through the virus. Finally, a loving and caring presence might as well assist one to recover. If, according to Dionysius, a higher percentage of Christians survived, then some important implications follow. The overall percentage of Christians would increase without any conversions, since many pagans died and fled. More to it, such a demographic shift would alter their social networks. Pagans would be much more likely to enter a Christian social network. Furthermore, if Christians did nurse pagans back to health, and there's no reason to suppose they didn't, this would be a wonderful opportunity to form social bonds and, importantly, remain an open social network. In short, these epidemics, ironically, might have been a great evangelical opportunity to welcome pagans into the Christian community. In conclusion, finally, this brief reflection was intended to supplement Bishop Barron's practical steps to break through the buffered self. Bishop Barron focused on the power of the transcendentals to do so, especially through the way of beauty. This paper has argued that social relations in early Christianity played an integral role in forming the base movement of the church, which then continued to expand. These relations, therefore, served as a powerful agent to help promote the growth of early Christianity against tremendous odds. Today as well, they can help to break through the buffered self. Often a strong Christian community is one of the best ways to point towards the true, the good, the beautiful, which is above all Christ himself. This argument contextualizes rather seemingly mundane parish events, such as fish fries, St. Joseph tables, basketball games. If they are used correctly, they can transform a parish community into an open network and invite the disaffiliated to faith in the one God who loves them. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Lupton. We will now give Bishop Barron a few minutes to respond to Father Lupton and Dr. Pintado, and then after that, we will open it up for questions from the audience. Either way, whichever you prefer.
Well, good. Thank you, first of all, both of you, for those responses. I promise this will be very, very brief. I want to get to your questions. Here's the first observation, really in regard to both responses. So what I would say at a Meyer lecture, so at this sort of high-level academic symposium, is not the sum total of what I would do to evangelize. So a lot of my work and Word on Fire would be reaching out to people through all kinds of other means. So the fact that we're giving a high-level academic lecture doesn't mean, oh, that's the only way that we evangelize. So Dr. Pintado's points about family and friendship and communion, absolutely, I agree with that. And a lot of the work that I do, these other levels involve that very much. I was just very intrigued too by the observation about Protestantism and Cardinal George, with the influence of Calvinism on our culture. I just go back to an experience I had in the Chicago area many years ago. I'd recently come back from France, where I was studying, and I used to give tours at Notre Dame in Paris, and I used to love to go to Chartres Cathedral, so I love the Gothic churches and all their splendor and color and so on. And I went out to Wheaton College, and I have a great reverence. I love Wheaton College, and I have great reverence for Billy Graham. I went to the Billy Graham Center and saw the podium that he preached from and artifacts about his life, and wonderful. And then we went into the chapel there, and it was an absolutely plain white space with a pulpit. And again, with all the reverence I can muster for Billy Graham, which is very sincere, I remember thinking to myself, something went wrong with the human spirit. Something went wrong that we got from Chartres to a completely empty white room. And part of that was the loss of beauty as a route of transcendence. And it was the result of some of that disenchantment that we talked about. So I think that's really right. But I agree with all that you said about the other means. And we don't reduce this to an academic exercise, of course. Although the Meyer lecture is an academic exercise, but not our evangelization. Father Brendan's talk was very interesting to me, hearing a lot of that for the first time, but I think that's right. I'm a Newman man, John Henry Newman, that it's very mysterious how we come to assent, he said. The moment we say, yes, that's true. What makes us do that? To some degree, it's a matter of intellection, Newman thought. To some degree, it's a matter of argumentation. But very often, it's a whole congeries of different influences and experiences and hunches and friendships and communities. And so that when you say that mysterious statement, I believe in Christianity, I believe in Jesus Christ, what's brought you to that point, I agree, is very mysterious. And it's rarely simply a question of a clinching argument. Though, as you know, I've been stressing the importance of the intellectual because we've dumbed the project down, and that's been very problematic. But that's why in my own talk, I emphasize it's not just the true, that's a way in, but the good. And under the rubric of the good, I would talk about things like friendship and about community and about social justice. That's true. The young people, they very much respond to our concern for the poor. Terrific. That's one way that the good breaks through. And then the beautiful, as I think I've sufficiently emphasized, that's not an intellectual argument. That's showing forth the beauty of a saint's life, for example, or the beauty of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So I quite agree, I think, with both my respondents that it's a much wider project than making arguments. Of course it is. But this is the forum where we make arguments at a Meyer lecture. But I certainly agree with all that. And furthermore, think it is the question of our time. I keep, out in LA, I keep beating that drum. It's that evangelization, especially of the young, has got to be priority one. So I think my two respondents contributed to that too, so thank you for that. So that's enough from me. Questions? What's our next move? Please.
So for the questions, please keep in mind Jesus' exhortation to love God and love your neighbor. And an important way of expressing love for your neighbor is to keep your question as concise and brief as possible so that your neighbor will enjoy listening to you, and also so that you leave space for other people to ask questions as well.
Hey, Bishop Barron. For Theology, Deacon Ben Thompson, Archdiocese of Atlanta. My question for you is in regards to the truth, the transcendental of the truth. Should we recover a divine illumination theory of knowledge as a way to deal with the escaping the cave of the buffered self? Let me kind of illuminate what I mean. So you judge by truth. Truth is that which is. Everything is not that which is except God himself, who is the light that enlightens all men. But sometime in the Middle Ages, we kind of replace that, maybe we say Thomas, with a mere likeness of the divine light that is a creature within us, and thus we judge inside ourselves, buffered selves, everything subjective potentially is the way that logic might lead. So do you think that we should try to recover a divine illumination theory of reason?
Well, is this working? No. Did that? Hello? Hello, there we go. No, I don't think you have to get into that kind of specificity, that you have to have an Augustinian epistemology rather than a Thomistic one. Thomas talks about the lumen agentis intellectus, so he has a version of it. But I don't think you have to make that move specifically to break through the buffer itself. I think if you sense the truth the way Thomas describes it, you're breaking through what has happened in modernity. So I think that would be sufficient. As you know from the talk, I'm deeply sympathetic with the Platonic tradition, love it, and I love Aquinas too, and I think Catholicism is big enough to contain both of those epistemological theories. So I wouldn't say you have to do it. Thank you for that.
And Seth Hostiller, Diocese of Cheyenne, Wyoming, for theology. If we take an Augustinian understanding of sin, and just describe it as choosing the lesser over the greater, then we might say that what gives rise to that is a disordered encounter with transcendentals. And if that's the case, perhaps greater emphasis needs to be on how these transcendentals, how we're forming that encounter. And so I'm especially thinking of social media, and in regards to a future priest, the homily, and the means by which we try to give access or create a forum in which the transcendentals are encountered. The homily has a very particular role in the liturgy, in this people in this time. And if you abstract that and you take it and you put it into social media, is there something about the medium of social media being very consumeristic, very entertainment-driven, that undermines our goal of trying to bring a transcendental that is properly ordered and properly understood?
Well, in a sense, sure. But at the same time, nothing's perfect, and nothing in this side of the eschaton is going to, just get everything right. So the fact that I would publish sermons online that are, viewed by 150,000 people every week, I think that's worthwhile, even though you're quite right that a sermon belongs within the liturgy. And the purpose of all of it is to bring people to the Mass. That's I would say the point of all my evangelistic work is to bring them to the Mass. So some would argue, well, no, that's not, you should just have the Mass, and this is all misleading. But I guess I'd say be a glass half full sort of guy when it comes to that. Sure, it's inadequate. It's like, I remember reading someone said when the telephone was first invented, someone goes, it's such an inelegant form of communication. Well, of course it is. You'd much rather have a conversation with someone, but who's going to put away their telephone? So I think we have to use the social media, but the instinct behind your question is a good one, that we have to be wary of it at the same time and aware of its limitations. But, I think glass half full on that one.
Hi, Bishop Barron. I have a question about your choice of the transcendentals. And I was wondering, in our time, there's an ever-increasing focus on diversity in the spectrum of choices and the multiplicity of things. And you didn't mention unity as an approach to just to being and to recognition, ultimately to God. And I was wondering why you left that out, or do you see a role for that?
Sometimes seen in the great tradition as one of the transcendentals too, unity, the one. And in that sense, sure, the one is great. There's the problem of the one and the many, which is the oldest problem in philosophy. But that we want to bring people to the one God, absolutely. That we want to gather people into the one church, absolutely. That we want to be one in Christ, sure. But then within that unity, there's plenty of room for pluralism. And the ground for that is the Trinity. So the one God subsists in three persons. So there can be a legitimate play. But, unity is always a good thing. But it doesn't preclude, real diversity. The problem today, I think, is we've so skewed that question, where it's diversity, diversity, diversity. But no one's speaking for unity anymore. It's like everyone wants the pluribus, no one wants the unum. And it's both we need. And if it's just nothing but diversity all the time, we lose what binds us together. We lose our communio, right? So it's always trying to find the balance. And that's as old as Plato, that problem. But it persists to this day, I think, very clearly, where our culture is enamored of diversity. But that's a dangerous move, because that becomes destabilizing. You can be hyper-focused on unity. Welcome to totalitarian societies and so on. But it's finding that right balance, which is the language of love, finally, is the reconciliation of the one and the many. So, quick answer to a complicated question.
Bishop, my name is Father Don Roskowski. I'm a priest at the Diocese of Peoria. I work at a Catholic hospital as my ministry. And a year ago, my mom and dad passed away. And part of what I'm seeking is comments on the transcendentals of being particularly focused on suffering. I loved your conversation with Jordan Peterson, but one of his things is truth is the antidote to suffering, and I would add goodness and beauty. So I'm seeking, perhaps, as I deal with people who are sick and dying, sometimes tragically, and people seeking the meaning of life, or like Manfred seeking for meaning from Viktor Frankl. So I was wondering, perhaps, and a comment or two, or thought, as Father Brennan kind of mentioned this idea of the plagues and suffering. Maybe some thought about applying the transcendentals to the particular suffering.
Yeah, that's good. That's a thoughtful remark. Certainly suffering can lead to a breakthrough of the buffered self. You know, it can lead you out of a self obsession. It can be a way of, of cracking through. So I think that's true. And so it might enable, as I was describing it, truth, goodness, and beauty to get in, and the Lord can use suffering for that reason. So I think that's right. I think that's certainly true in pastoral settings, I found. Not that we're trying to foist suffering upon people, but I think it can be an opportunity for a real breakthrough. I think that's right. Please.
Bishop Barron, John Foppe, Executive Director of St. Vincent de Paul Society of the Archdiocese of St. Louis.
St. Louis.
In that same vein of suffering, and maybe viewing the nuns as a suffering group as well, not to sound antagonistic, but has the church lost the courage to enter into the breach and help people with their suffering and be with them in their suffering? Just would appreciate your perspective and commentary around courage to enter into that breach.
Well, I hope not. I don't think so. I think of all the different ministries, including your own, right, that the church has that reach out to people in their suffering. Certainly, gosh, the years I was up here training young men to be priests, that was a huge focus pastorally, is how to enter into people's times of pain and suffering. So I don't know. I don't sense that. Where do you see that we're not entering into people's pain?
I think with the whole question of powerlessness, there's such a drive in our culture to want to fix the situation, and to help people understand that so oftentimes you're powerless. And then there's the opportunity to enter into relationship with the crucified Christ.
Sure.
And that's where I see that message just doesn't seem to permeate or radiate anymore from the church.
Yeah, if that's true, that's regrettable. I hope that's not true. In my experience with priests, both here and LA, that they seem pretty willing to enter into those painful places with people. And I think that's my understanding of priesthood. It means your willingness to go into those places, to go all the way down as Christ did. So hope that's still the case, Please.
Really great talks, guys, and your response is wonderful. Food for thought. Sean Glanville, deacon to be. I live maybe in many ways the way many people in this audience do. I have one son that I hope to be at Mundelein next year. I've got another son who's going to get married, joyful experience, to a non-baptized woman. And he's one of those nuns that's scandalized for whatever reasons by the church, has a great sense of justice, lives in a great community of friends, but he's going to get married outside of the church. So I'm just at that point in this book, Seven Storied Mountains,
Merton,
Thomas Merton,
yeah.
where he, right in spite of his own intentions, he's wandering the streets of Rome, and he comes and he's looking at mosaics, and he finally encounters the mosaics in the churches, and he's converted. He's converted through beauty, so it tracks to what you say. But here's the deal. Beauty is the initiative of the Creator and our receptivity to it. So how do we, as evangelists in the new evangelization, pivot towards somebody that responds to beauty? I mean, I'm impatient. So how do we walk with those nuns that don't even perceive, they see the beauty, but they don't know the source of the beauty?
Yeah. No, it's good, and I'm glad you held up that book, which is a very important book for me in my own conversion, really. You know, look at Merton. Yes, you're right. The beauty of the churches in Rome that mysteriously got into his soul. Think of the death of his grandparents and the death of his mother earlier, how that experience of suffering had a lot to do with it. But then also think when Merton picks up Etienne Gilson's Spirit of Medieval Philosophy and reads this deeply coherent doctrine of God, which he never dreamed existed, that God was esse ipsum subsistens and all that. So my point there is the beautiful, the good, the true were all operative in Merton's conversion. And it's never one or the other. And it depends on the person. I just tell the students here, you got to be a very nimble sort of evangelist. There's never one way to do it, and it depends on the person you're talking to. Some people respond really well to beauty. Others respond like the justice thing. So was it your son-in-law to be or daughter-in-law? The passion for justice, start there. Because they don't think that's subjective. They don't think that's a little private opinion they have. They think that's objectively real and good, right? Good, start with that. Because that's a way to break through the buffered self. And then, as I developed in this paper, both etiologically and teleologically, it'll lead you to God if you let it go. Other people, I know tons of them, have intellectual issues and questions. Fine, begin with that. What do they think is true? A lot of young people, sciences. Terrific, start there. In other words, get a foothold any way you can with any of the transcendentals. And it depends on the individual which one works, but you got to be nimble and fast on your feet, you know, like a tennis player, able to respond to the ball as it comes. There isn't one way to do it, but lots of ways. Please.
Yeah, my question to you is, when you're coming back to Chicago, we need you.
Oh.
My name is Ron Kirsch. I'm a father also of 6 beautiful children with my wife, grandfather of 9 grandchildren. I'm probably a perfect example of the buffered self. I put on here titled Judgmentalism, if that is. I don't have a doctorate, but I think that's a word. My mother ingrained in me the saying, truth is only truth if it manifests love. Otherwise, it is just fact.
Yeah, good.
So I could tell someone to jump in the lake if I tell them with love and respect. In raising my children, I have tried to pass on this wisdom of truth versus fact in light of manifesting love. Sometimes I encountered rebellion, of course, from the children, or criticized from other families that judge how I'm raising my children as being judgmental, like your clothes are too tight, or your friends are a bad influence, or you're too much on social media. My question to you is, do you encounter a similar challenge of walking on needles when promoting the truth as manifesting love, or judgmental promoting an agenda? Is it okay to use our judgment to promote true love?
Yeah, no, there's a lot there, and again, I think it's a case by case. Sometimes a moral demand gets through to people in a big way, and so look at the Bible. I mean, look at the prophets. Judgmental. They're constantly pronouncing judgment on Israel. Sometimes that works for people. Sometimes that really gets through and wakes them up. Other times, all the hackles go up, and you have to know the person you're dealing with. People today, in our postmodern culture, you start pontificating about here's the way you ought to behave. I find with young people, they really oppose that, especially in the sexual order. They hate our sexual teaching. I mean, study after study has shown that. So I might recommend not beginning there, you know, with young people. Now, I'm not saying bracket it. I'm saying get there indeed. But you might start in a different way, you know. So it depends. It depends on the, you know, the psychology of like your own kids a lot better than I do, and you know, you've just got to be creative and nimble when it comes to it. Use what works. I'd be very pragmatic. Use what works. What brings people to Christ? It might be, you know, all kinds of different things. So that's a quick answer to it's a complex set of things you're asking there.
Thank you.
Please.
thanks to all the speakers for these great reflections. My question has to do with two things you've talked a lot about in your ministry, Bishop Barron, which is one, the idea of the culture of self-invention, and two, your suggestion that we should always look for points of contact with the environing culture. And one thing I think touches on both of these ideas is the connection between transgenderism, which crudely is the idea that a man can transition into being a woman, and vice versa, and transubstantiation, which very crudely is the idea that bread can transition into being a man. Now, yes, they both have the word trans in it, which sometimes leads me to joke with my friends that they're being very transphobic whenever they give me a hard time for believing in the real presence. But apart from that trivial comparison, they do seem to have a deeper connection, which is the idea that appearance and reality can diverge. And one of the reasons I find that comparison helpful is because it touches on another one of your teachings, which is that we shouldn't domesticate the strangeness of Christianity, but rather that we should argue how that very strangeness corresponds to deep intuitions people already have about the nature of reality, even if they sometimes follow those intuitions to incorrect conclusions. So my question is, do you think that this belief in the divergence between appearance and reality, which is now such a large part of the culture of self-invention, is something evangelists can appeal to when trying to argue for the real presence with the popular culture? And if so, how can we do that in a way that, in your words, allows us to accept what we can, but resist what we must? Thank you.
I'm not sure how I'd respond. I think I know what you mean, but it's such a, and you're using a lot of my own material, I know there, which is good. Yeah, the transgender thing, though, and any suggestion that it's similar to transubstantiation is a non-starter. I mean, there's a superficial linguistic, connection, and to use that as a means of evangelization, I don't think that's going to be a wise move. I'll tell you one thing: when the California bishops met with Pope Francis right before COVID, we had the ad limina visit, and we had a 3-hour conversation with him. As we were leaving, he said, one more thing I want to really emphasize. You have to resist the gender ideology. You have to stand to thwart that because it's repugnant to the Bible, to our anthropology, and it's doing a lot of damage. So Pope Francis told us that as our marching orders. So I certainly wouldn't want to use, sort of a transgender ideology to back up the doctrine of transubstantiation. The appearance reality, the issue there, like with transubstantiation, is you're dealing with God, who's immaterial, and God's capacity as radically other to enter non-competitively into the world of nature. You're not dealing with, a question of biological sexuality. So that they're just different language games being played there, I'd say. So, I mean, you use what works, but I wouldn't recommend using that, I don't think, as an evangelical strategy. And then look, the church's stance toward people with gender dysphoria or with those issues is always one of love and always one of outreach and of deep sympathy and with deep concern and care. So I never want to give the impression that we approach that in a sort of flippant way. But I think we have to be clear, too, about the objectivities, under consideration. So, again, that's a quick answer to all kinds of subtle stuff that you raised there. But
yeah, hi, thanks so much. So my question is about affectivity, because it seems like the modern move that's really unfortunate around objective beauty and feeling is not just this movement to make it into the merely subjectively satisfying. That's for sure. I totally agree with that. That's super problematic. But to actually, sorry?
Yeah. No.
Okay. But to simultaneously shut down affectivity entirely, right?
Shut down what? I couldn't hear the word.
Affectivity, feeling and emotion.
Feeling.
Yeah, so what I'm thinking here is that, in the presence of this divinely, consummately beautiful, objectively beautiful face of Christ, because of human finitude, original sin, and concupiscence, instead of feeling just love, awe, wonder, trust, and devotion to Christ in return, I also feel fear, dread, exposure, vulnerability, and I'm actually afraid of my own feelings of vulnerability. So how do we open people up to an expression of affectivity that will open them up to the beauty of the transcendent?
Yeah, and I'm not opposed to that at all. In fact, I, as you heard in the talk, I frequently mentioned Dietrich von Hildebrand, who's the great philosopher of the heart, and he felt the tradition tended to overlook that too much, and he defined heart as the seat of the emotions. And he identifies it. We tend to say, when you really fall in love with someone, I'm going to give you my heart. And he thought that was very important. I don't say, I'm going to give you my mind. Oh, thank you very much. You know, there's something about the heart that is so elemental in us, and that we do respond to truth, goodness, and beauty affectively as well. So I don't want to shut that down in any way. I think we should open up the heart as one of the organs by which we respond to the transcendentals, especially beauty. So no, I think we should open that up. And that's part of the genius of Catholicism, that we have something like a Sacred Heart devotion. We don't have a devotion to the Sacred Mind, you know, I mean, but to the Sacred Heart, and that's meant to, you know, awaken my heart too. So I'm with you on that. We should awaken the heart, not put it to sleep. Absolutely.
So
Please.
I'm going to intervene here at this point. So we have 16 minutes remaining. So we have a hard stop time of 11:45, and we have 10 people still in line for questions. So here's what I'd like to ask all of you to do. Those of you who are currently in line, please state your question and also state who you're referring the question to, Bishop Barron, Father Lupton, Dr. Pintado, and then sit down and all of you can take notes on what the questions are, and then Bishop Barron and others can respond to them all at one time.
Sure.
Hi, I'm asking about the rise of STEM university degrees, the decline of liberal arts degrees, and I'm wondering if you think it's because of the rise of relativism, and if our students today aren't reading Plato, Joyce, Locke. Is that it? And are we better off reminding and encouraging the truth of the universality and the truth of math and sciences, such as the golden ratio or the cosmos?
Hi, I'm a PhD candidate in organizational behavior and human resource management, and one thing that's really struck me in my journey, in my PhD journey, is that a lot of our theories are tainted by this idea of self-invention and self-determination. In fact, one of our leading theories of work motivation is called self-determination theory. So what I've started to do is to reject some of those theories in my writing and in my teaching, but I'm worried, I'm concerned that as I do this, I'm going to be left with nothing to teach and nothing to write about. So I'm curious, what approach can I take? Do I take, you know, Bishop Barron, you talk about the steel man and the straw man argument. You know, do I try to do that, or do I just keep eliminating theories? Thank you.
Okay. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you, Bishop Barron, panel responders. This morning, I'm Mark Knoppi. I'm a Lutheran pastor. I am not a cultural Calvinist, nor a Calvinist. Happy to be here. Bishop Barron, last night you were talking about the importance of contemplation. And again, a little while ago you just mentioned you know, the importance absolutely of bringing people to the Mass. Now, one of my frustrations as a Lutheran pastor is in the Mass, in the Lutheran Mass, we get the true, we get the good, but often where's the beauty, where's the transcendence? And I'm sure Roman Catholics don't have this difficulty in the Mass. Yeah, and just the power of beauty to convert, to bring people to the faith. Liturgical apologetics, you know, as we well know, the example of 10th century Hagia Sophia was responsible for converting Mother Russia. How can we be better attentive today in the Mass, Lutherans, Catholics, to inculcating a sense of beauty within the Mass? And then just one more quick comment to our first responder. The late Richard John Newhouse, Father John Newhouse, would say any homily or any presentation that begins with the words "and Ratzinger said" would be well worthwhile. So thank you.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name's Jim Vandelote. I just want to thank you for answering my questions and teaching me how to argue. I'm just a parishioner and a father of three. I love my church, and you often talk about this culture of indifference, this culture that's afraid to offend, and I'm afraid that's permeating even at the parish level, that at least what we're experiencing. About a year ago, my good friend Luis, who was here last night and asked you a question, we brought to our attention the Word on Fire Engage to our parish leadership, and essentially we were told thank you but no. And part of it was the Come Back to Mass series, and how in your introduction to that, you mentioned that missing Mass is a mortal sin, and they look at it as, well, we're not going to attract people like that. We're not going to attract people by offending them, And I disagree. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's in the delivery. But I just struggle with a parish who's afraid to talk about abortion, afraid to talk about so many of these, core teachings of the church, for fear that we're going to lose people, but we're already losing people. And it's because what we're doing is not working. And I just would love to hear your feedback on that. Thank you.
Yeah, Father Marek Duran. I'm on the faculty here in the Department of Moral Theology. And so, because I'm in the moral theology, I will be concerned with the good, obviously. And you draw the distinction between the likes and love. And I think it's coming from because moral theology, it's the purpose of that is there were questions about that, by deification of the human being. And so making a human being that he's able to laugh with those who love and cry with those who cry. And so it's the problem with the buffered self is the self that is self-contained but is incredibly afraid and fragile. So it's like, and also that's connected with young people who are in the stage of development of their own self.
Yeah.
And so it's in this kind of the situation, making oneself to be open to love, it's making oneself to be also vulnerable, and that shatters the people in lacking on themselves, in lacking on themselves. And so because of that, the suffering is a double-edged sword, which can cause people to lack on themselves because of the experience of their love, and also turn them out of themselves, as Fulton Sheen said. If you have the problem with your teenager, send him on the mission to the poor country,
right?
And his buffer itself will be closed. But I would like to ask all of you about your impressions about fragility of the buffer itself.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Hi, Linda Corey. I'm also on faculty here. Thanks for being here, Bishop Barron. I'm just wondering, more important than me being a faculty member here, I'm a mother of 2 sons in high school. And I'm always trying to capitalize on the good that's happening right now. So I know transgender was mentioned, but there's kind of this opportunity right now where they're in this position where they're confused because they actually believe in the idea, the whole idea of the idea of self being separated from the body, so they can comprehend, my friend is a boy trapped in a woman's body, a girl's body. At the same time, they say, I don't believe in God because science goes against it. But they're smart. They know that there's a contradiction. So I'm wondering if in the middle of this, there might be an opportunity to talk to kids that are kind of caught between these two things that contradict themselves. I think it'd be helpful.
Yeah,
Thanks.
that's interesting.
Hello, I'm Bea Kwasa. I graduated from undergrad just this past year. This question is directed for Dr. Pintado as well as Bishop Barron. It has been deeply unsettling to see how young people and my peers, myself included, have been influenced by the Protestant worth ethic. And as much as we place our self-worth in our accomplishments and our achievements, and I'm wondering what's the alternative to that?
Good morning. Thank you for all of your wisdom and speaking to us. My name is Jessica, and I am a woman. I'm not anything special. I'm a convert of 7 years, and my history prior prior to coming into the Catholic Church, I went into a lot of different Protestant, I explored a lot, let's just say. And one thing that I learned was that Protestants, at least in my experience, are really, really good about forming small groups and journeying with people in a wide variety of ages and times in their life, and they all kind of gather together to journey in faith together a little bit better than sometimes Catholics do. And so my question is, because that's such an integral part of the culture of Protestant church, how can we move in a Catholic, like how can we incorporate something like that in our Catholic faith so that we provide an area that's not an echo chamber for our own thoughts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Bishop Barron, I love your materials you have. I'm a youth minister, and a year ago I got certified, nationally certified, and actually you signed my certificate. My question to you is, working with young people with a pandemic or plague, what can we do to bring back the nuns?
Bishop Barron, I'm the father of 9. My youngest son, 18 years old, is back here, super excited to be here with you. My youngest sister, also one of 9, is also here. You know, thanks to the grace of God, and people like you listening to your podcast has kept us all in the faith. We have a sister-in-law who's bedridden. We're preparing her for death. And the only thing she tolerates on her TV is your sermons and your
God bless her.
podcast. Anything else she says, turn it off.
No, God bless her.
My question for you is actually a prayer request that we prepare her well for her death. And we do have priests that come in regularly to take care of that with us. Also for the Paulos family, there's many of us and we're all spread out. And then also this evening, my other son Joseph wanted to be here, but he's going to go with 2 friends who are also, all 3 of them are young dads, to go see Jordan Peterson. And he wants to put St. Josemaría's book, The Stations of the Cross, in Jordan Peterson's hands. So we're praying for his conversion as well.
Yeah,
so
okay.
my question is a prayer request. Thank you so much.
God bless you.
I am Father Maciej from Society of Christ, and my question is connected to that topic of truth and beauty. And one of the most intriguing description of encounter between scientific rationality and aesthetic and spiritual experience is Polish book Michelangelo in Ravensbrück, written by Countess Karolina Lanskorońska. And Countess described in this book her experience from concentration camp in Ravensbrück, Germany. And on the one hand, there is an orthopedist, German professor Gebhardt, who comes from sanatorium and performs experimental operation on Polish women. And on the other side, there is imprisoned Polish countess who gives them lectures on the history of European culture. And she wrote that during the Great Week, from Monday, Thursday, I chose Leonardo Last Supper. For the Good Friday and Easter Sunday, I choose suitable works by Michelangelo. And today I can only express the hope that I gave my listeners what I received from them, the chance to tear oneself away from the moral and physical squalor, dysentery, humiliation surrounding us, and return to those values that once constituted my own very special world. And so right now, when I am thinking about shameful confrontation between scientific reason and faith, I am thinking about Professor Gebhardt and Countess Lanskorońska. However, I realized that I was educated, trained, and formatted in Catholic institution to think in that context of shameful encounter between scientific reason and faith, automatically about Galileo. And even one of the most significant Polish Catholic intellectuals said after John Paul II passed away that his biggest achievement was rehabilitation of Galileo.
Yeah,
It's a joke.
right.
Father, we're
So-
short on time.
Yeah,
Could you
yeah.
get to your question,
and
please?
this is my question. So, do you think that we as a Catholics have that tendency to demonize the history of ecclesiastical relation to science and angelize the history of science as a pure and immaculate progress? And second question about prayer, do you think that we should not only pray for next Copernicus or Mendel, but also for Catholic Foucault or Feyerabend, who will teach us how to expose idolatry of science and to ridicule its pride and tyrannic appetites?
Thank you. Last question.
Please.
Last night, as we were leading, I said to someone, I felt like I was watching Paul talk to the Hellenist in Acts 5 or 6. Today, I felt like I was listening to Paul speaking to Peter in the Council of Jerusalem. My question is, as a bishop, what must we do together as a Catholic Church and globally as the Christian Church that we cannot do apart?
That we cannot
do apart, that we must do together.
You mean the Christian churches.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, is there a message? What you did today blew us away, over the last 2 days. You opened up our minds to think in different ways. And for me, as I listened to you speak, we were pushing against the boundaries of the buffer. And I thought, the veil, the veil in the temple. And God never stops pushing back. What must we do as a church to pull away the veil?
So thank you all for those 12 questions. It's 11:44. We have 1 minute remaining. So maybe we could go 5 minutes over. Bishop Barron, if you could give us just 5 minutes.
Oh, gosh.
Touch on those, and then maybe Father Lupton and Dr. Pintado, any final comments you might have.
Sure,
to add.
I'll 2 minutes. There's so much there, obviously, and they're so rich, the questions. One of the questions about the liberal arts, in many ways, this whole paper, these 44 pages, were a sort of cri de coeur on my part in favor of the recovery of the liberal arts, over and against this sort of technologized view of knowledge, and that we as a church, as the bearers of the true, the good, and the beautiful, for their own sakes, that's the point. Liber, free. It's free from utility. And last night, I use it as a laugh line on purpose, say that I'm for the most useless things. Useless things are the best things. And the liberal arts are free from utility. But see, we're in danger of losing that. And that's causing real damage to people's souls. And so the liberal arts, absolutely, the recovery of that is super important. The question about I said missing mass is a moral sin. I wonder if they paid attention to how I explained that in the video, which was not legalistically, but simply in terms of spiritual physics. If we stay away from the worship of God on a regular basis, we're doing deadly damage to our souls. That's simply true. That's not some legalistic, pharisaical remark. That's simply the case. And that's the point I made. If they'd listened to the video more carefully, I don't think they'd see it as legalistic or off-putting. I was trying to explain why the church keeps saying, we need to worship God. We need to worship God. And if you don't worship God, then you turn inward. You turn into the buffered self. And it does mortal damage. It's like your doctor will say to you, you're eating, Fritos and Big Macs and never exercising and smoking 4 packs a day. You're in mortal danger. He's not being pharisaical. He's being honest. So that's my, I love the stuff about suffering and that many have brought up. And absolutely as a way in. And the Father Mark's remark about the fragility, I think, is important too. And when I love another and allow another to love me, there is this kind of vulnerability. And part of the buffering of the self is that defensiveness. No one gets in, and I won't make myself vulnerable to another. And that's dangerous stuff because we need to fall in love with God, but falling in love with another person is often the vehicle for that. So I think that is very important. Jordan Peterson, I'll say one thing about Jordan Peterson, whom I've had a couple dialogues with. But isn't it interesting? Why don't you think about him? You think he's crazy and all that, fine. But isn't it interesting that here's this layman, doesn't have a theological degree or background, doesn't wear any kind of clerical garb. He's not a really compelling speaker, like he's not a polished orator, but he's thinking out loud about the Bible. And millions of young people are responding to him. You know, and I've said to my brother bishops, I said, I don't care what you think about the guy, but there's something we should be paying attention to here, that this guy is getting tens of thousands coming to his talks and millions online. What is it? And what he's doing, those of us who have studied the Bible know exactly what he's doing, uncovering what the church fathers called the moral sense of the Bible. He's doing kind of psychological language, but it's the Bible as a moral instruction. And he's tapped into it in a way that they're responding to. So we should learn from that. This is the last comment. What can the churches do together? You know, I love that. We should love each other and let people see that. I've been in a lot of Protestant Catholic dialogues over the years, and you know, we can debate the 16th century till the cows come home. We've been doing it for 500 years, and I get in those conversations, justification and all that, and papal authority. But I've said to my Protestant friends, look, we got a common enemy now who's much more dangerous. It's the secularized world. People that don't believe in God. 40% of young people don't go to church and don't claim any religious identity. We shouldn't be fighting right now about justification. We should be talking about God. You know, we should be talking about God and about Jesus Christ, and we should make common ground against the common enemy of secularism. So I think that's what the churches can do together, you know. All right, that's enough out of it. Go ahead, please.
Father Lupton and Dr. Pintado.
Sure, thank you, Dr. Barrett. In many of the different questions, I heard a fair amount of real pastoral concern, especially for the disaffiliated and the nuns, and it just reminds me of an anecdote I learned here as a seminarian. Sister Sarah Butler, who was a faculty member here for many years, one of the things that she mentioned to us in a class was she said, if you're struggling with a particular area, maybe find a saint who struggled in that same way. And not only ask for their intercession, but come to know their story and maybe be able to read a biography or something along those lines. So a story to me that very much comes to mind, and especially think about the disaffiliate today, is Augustine's Confessions. And just reading through that story, you see how when Augustine reflects later, he went away in so many different ways and how God kept on calling him back. And as you know, the famous story that his mother didn't want him to go to Rome, and he went just for fame and for promotion. He goes to Rome, he goes there, and there he reads Cicero's Hortensius. And that really led him to the way of wisdom, started his conversion. So at the moment that he seemed to be most lost, he was actually, in some ways, becoming the most found. So I think in some ways that can be a help for all of us who are concerned about nuns and disaffiliated to find a saint, in some ways, that also struggle in those same ways as an intercessor and a friend in that process. And just finally, with Father Mark's question, asking about the fragility, again, thinking about Augustine's Confessions, it's fascinating how that book begins. Our hearts are restless. And Augustine speaking not just about my heart, but the human heart, since its inception, is made for God. And in that way, there's many opportunities for it to come to God through many different avenues.
I'd be very brief. I think what's one of the most compelling questions we can pose to young people and old, particularly in our culture, is what kind of happiness they're pursuing. Because, as I already mentioned, particularly the pressure is essentially to seek success and acquire a lot of money. And at least older people that have reached that goal, that's the moment when they may be thinking about what's missing and the longing that Taylor talks about, because they have acquired and they have all the possessions they wanted, and nevertheless, they don't seem to be satisfied. I guess that's one of the ways in which we can start, and it can happen already with a 29-year-old successful businesswoman or man. So the question right there is to say, look, and I follow Aristotle in this, no matter how much you have, not only is there a problem of never being satisfied, but you're constantly in fear of losing those things because they are just material possessions. And they may be still yearning for being acknowledged for who they are and not for what they have. Because again, the affirmation of the others based on your success can go away. And so I would say, following that path, that's when you can start talking about, and again, like Aristotle would say, it's not that you give them instructions about, you're going to be more fulfilled when you have more virtues, but that by looking and engaging with people who have virtue, you start learning how to be friends and how those friends, and Peterson makes a big deal, I think that's the third rule of his 15 rules. Just make sure you find friends who are going to help you to be good.
So a reminder, our campus bookstore is open if you'd like to buy some books of Bishop Barron. And we thank all of our speakers this morning, and thank you all for coming.